We think of time as an arrow flying forward. The ancients saw it as a wheel, endlessly turning. They believed they'd seen this turn before, and they knew what came next. Right now, in this moment, you probably imagine history as a line stretching behind us. Primitive beginnings gradually giving way to progress. Stone tools becoming bronze, bronze becoming iron, darkness slowly yielding to enlightenment. We stand at the furthest point of that line, the most advanced humanity has ever been, looking back at everything that came before with a kind of gentle superiority. The past was ignorant. We are informed. The trajectory only moves one direction, upward and forward. But this way of seeing time is younger than you might think. This notion that history progresses in a straight line from worse to better, from simple to complex, only truly took hold in the last few centuries. Before that, for thousands upon thousands of years, across landscapes and languages that never touched, human beings understood time completely differently. They saw it as a circle, an eternal wheel turning through endless seasons, not progress, but pattern, not a line climbing towards something better, but a cycle spinning through the same phases again and again. Growth and decay, creation and destruction, flourishing and collapse, birth and death and rebirth. This wasn't abstract philosophy invented by isolated thinkers in distant temples. It was practical observation, something anyone could see if they simply watched the world long enough. Ancient farmers didn't need calendars to understand cycles. They watched their crops push through soil each spring, swell with life through summer, wither in autumn, die in winter. Every year, the same pattern. Death wasn't an ending, but a promise of return. The seed that fell into darkness would emerge again when the wheel turned. They watched the moon appear as a sliver, grow full and bright, shrink back to nothing, return as a sliver once more. 29 days, over and over, unchanging in its change. They tracked the sun's yearly journey from the long bright days of summer to the short cold darkness of winter and back again. The heavens themselves turned in circles. They watched kingdoms around them rise from nothing, grow powerful, become arrogant, collapse into ruins. They saw this happen not once but repeatedly. Civilizations bloomed and withered like crops in a field. From all this observation emerged something profound. Everything that exists moves through patterns: birth, maturity, decline, death, then rebirth. Nothing escapes the wheel. Here's where it becomes strange. The Maya in the jungles of Central America developed this understanding. So did the Hindus in India, the Greeks beside the Mediterranean, the Norse in the frozen north. Cultures separated by oceans and millennia. Peoples who never met, never traded, never even knew the others existed. All of them arrived at nearly identical conclusions about the nature of time. They all saw the wheel. They all mapped out ages of rise and fall. They all predicted that what had happened before would happen again. This isn't coincidence. This is pattern. The question that echoes across all those separated voices is simple and unsettling. What were they seeing that we've stopped looking for? The Greeks called it the Great Year. The Hindus called it the Yugas. The Maya called it the World Ages. Different names for the same prophecy. This world will end, and a new one will begin. The ancient Greeks didn't just observe cycles, they calculated them. Plato wrote about something called the Great Year, a cosmic cycle lasting thousands upon thousands of years. At the end of this cycle, the universe returns to its original configuration. The stars align exactly as they were at the beginning. And history starts over. Not similar history, the same history. The same souls reborn into the same lives, making the same choices, living the same joys and tragedies. In the myth of Plato described souls choosing their next lives between cycles, worlds being periodically destroyed and renewed, everything returning to begin again. This wasn't presented as metaphor. This was cosmology, the structure of reality itself. Halfway across the world, Hindu scholars mapped time with mathematical precision. They described 4 ages, the Yugas, each one a step down from the perfection that came before. The Satya Yuga was the golden age, when humans lived for thousands of years and knew truth instinctively. Then came the Treta Yuga, where virtue diminished slightly. Then the Dvapara Yuga, where decline accelerated. Finally, the Kali Yuga, the age of darkness, ignorance, and moral decay. According to their calculations, we're living in the Kali Yuga right now, the final age before destruction and reset. In the jungles of Central America, the Maya and Aztec peoples told a similar story but with different details. They spoke of 4 previous worlds, each destroyed by catastrophe. The first world ended when jaguars devoured the sun. The second was swept away by hurricanes. The third consumed by fire raining from the sky. The fourth drowned beneath floods that covered mountains. We live in the fifth world, they said, and it will end in earthquakes that swallow cities whole. In the frozen north, Norse peoples told of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, a final battle where everything burns and sinks into the sea. But even Ragnarok isn't truly the end. After destruction, the world emerges again, green and new. A handful of gods and humans survive to repopulate. The wheel turns once more. Different cultures, different gods, different languages, oceans and millennia separating them, yet all describing the same basic structure. A golden beginning, progressive deterioration through distinct ages, violent, catastrophic ending, rebirth into a new golden age. The similarities are too precise to dismiss. All describe ages getting shorter as the cycle progresses. All place moral and spiritual decline at the center of the pattern. All promise that destruction isn't meaningless, but necessary, the only way to cleanse corruption and begin fresh. These weren't just stories told around fires. They were frameworks ancient peoples used to understand where they stood in time, to predict what came next, to prepare. And what came next, according to every one of these frameworks, was an ending. Ancient flood myths aren't just stories. Geologists now find evidence of the actual floods. What if cyclical prophecies weren't predictions, but memories, warnings from those who'd already watched their world end? We tend to think of myths as imagination, fantasy invented to explain what ancient peoples couldn't understand, but that assumption is crumbling. Oral traditions are far more durable than we once believed. Studies of Aboriginal Australian songlines reveal accurate geographical information preserved for over 10,000 years. Stories describing coastlines that existed before sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age. Memories spanning hundreds of generations, staying intact enough to match geological records. If people can remember coastlines for 10 millennia, what else might they remember? Nearly every ancient culture tells flood stories. The biblical deluge, the Epic of Gilgamesh, Greek myths of Deucalion's flood, Hindu accounts of Manu surviving the waters, Chinese legends of Gunyu taming the floods, Native American tales of world-drowning rains. These stories appear everywhere, in cultures that never contacted each other. For a long time, scholars dismissed this as coincidence or parallel invention. Then geologists found evidence. Massive floods did occur. The Black Sea was once a freshwater lake until the Mediterranean broke through, flooding thousands of square miles in what must have been a catastrophic event for anyone living there. Sea levels rose dramatically as ice sheets melted, drowning coastal settlements across the globe. Ancient peoples witnessed these disasters and remembered. But it wasn't just floods. Volcanic eruptions appear in myths worldwide. The explosion of Thera in the Mediterranean, one of the largest eruptions in human history, likely inspired stories of divine wrath destroying civilizations. Plato's account of Atlantis sinking beneath the waves might preserve garbled memories of Thera's destruction and the collapse of Minoan civilization. Even meteor impacts left marks in mythology. Researchers now link certain ancient accounts of fire from heaven to actual impact events evidenced in geological records. Here's what changes everything. If ancient peoples remembered real catastrophes, then their theories about cycles might not be mystical prophecy, but empirical observation. Think about how this works. Your grandfather tells you about the great drought that killed half the village. His grandfather told him about an earlier drought. Stories accumulate across generations. Patterns emerge. Disasters happen regularly. Civilizations that grow too proud get destroyed. New ones rise from the ashes. This happens over and over. To ancient minds, this looked like cosmic law, inevitable cycles. To us, it might look like climate patterns, geological events, and social dynamics playing out across centuries. Different frameworks, same observations. The crucial realization: cyclical theories might have emerged from watching actual repeating patterns. Droughts returning every few generations, neighboring kingdoms rising and falling in predictable sequences, social problems preceding collapse in recognizable ways. They weren't predicting the future through magic. They were reading patterns in their lived historical experience, and those patterns told them the wheel always turns. The age of collapse always comes. What happened before happens again. Ancient priests kept records spanning centuries. They watched kingdoms rise and fall with predictable regularity. When they warned of coming resets, they weren't prophesying, they were reading patterns in the data. Herodotus traveled across the known world in the 5th century BCE, seeking out ruins of civilizations already ancient in his time. He interviewed Egyptian priests who claimed their records stretched back thousands of years. They told him about multiple cycles of civilization and destruction, events we would never know about because they happened before our historical record begins. These priests had advantages we've lost. They could read inscriptions that we can no longer decipher. They spoke with people whose cultures have since vanished. They examined ruins before centuries of erosion wore them away further. When they spoke of previous cycles, they might have been describing something they could actually see in their historical records. Babylonian astronomers kept observations spanning centuries, tracking celestial patterns alongside earthly events. Their records revealed regularities invisible to individual observers, but apparent across generations. They noticed correlations, certain astronomical configurations preceding droughts, social upheavals following predictable patterns. Chinese historians documented dynastic cycles with remarkable consistency. Each dynasty followed similar patterns: founding by strong leaders, expansion, prosperity, corruption, decay, collapse, new dynasty. The cycle took roughly 300 years. After watching this happen repeatedly, predicting the next cycle wasn't mysticism. It was pattern recognition. What made these observers different wasn't supernatural insight. It was institutional memory. Temple priests served for life, and trained successors who served for life. Records passed from generation to generation. This allowed them to notice patterns that individual humans, living 70 or 80 years, couldn't possibly see. 100-year droughts, multi-generational social changes, climate shifts playing out over centuries, patterns of urban growth and collapse, the accumulation of small decisions leading to predictable outcomes. They became experts at reading the signs. They noticed that civilizations seemed to last certain durations before internal contradictions caused collapse. That specific types of social problems, growing inequality, declining birth rates, loss of civic virtue preceded downfalls. That certain celestial events correlated with earthly disasters, whether through actual causation or mere coincidence, didn't matter. The correlation was real enough to observe. When these ancient scholars warned about coming resets, they weren't channeling divine revelation. They were doing what historians do, analyzing past patterns to anticipate future developments. Their conceptual frameworks were different from ours. They spoke of cosmic wheels and divine judgment rather than socioeconomic factors and systems collapse. But the analytical method was recognizable. They'd watched enough kingdoms crumble to know what crumbling looked like. They'd seen the warning signs enough times to recognize them appearing again. And in their time, as in ours, they saw those signs emerging, the patterns repeating, the wheel turning toward its inevitable destination. What they'd witnessed before was happening again. Around 1200 BCE, the most advanced civilizations on Earth simultaneously collapsed. Palaces burned, writing vanished, trade stopped. The world entered a dark age that lasted 3 centuries. Those who remembered called it the end of an age. Before the collapse, the Mediterranean and Near East formed an interconnected world system, more sophisticated than anything that would exist again for over 1,000 years. The Hittite Empire controlled Anatolia with ironclad military might. Mycenaean Greece flourished with palace complexes that administered entire regions through detailed bureaucratic records. Egypt's new kingdom stood at the height of its power, building monuments that still stun us today. These civilizations weren't isolated. They traded extensively, exchanged diplomatic correspondence, intermarried their royal families, shared technologies. Archaeologists have found letters between kings discussing trade agreements, marriage alliances, requests for gold and grain. The system was globalized, complex, prosperous. Bronze, an alloy requiring tin and copper from different regions, flowed through trade networks spanning thousands of miles. Literacy was widespread among administrative classes. Cities thrived. Then, within approximately 50 years, it all came apart. The Hittite Empire didn't just decline. It vanished. Its capital, Hattusa, was abandoned so completely that its location was lost until modern archaeologists rediscovered it. Mycenaean palace centers across Greece burned. Most were never rebuilt. The palace at Pylos was destroyed so suddenly that clay tablets in the archive were still wet when fire baked them, preserving records of the final desperate days. Egyptian records speak of invasions by mysterious sea peoples, displaced populations sweeping through the eastern Mediterranean, destroying everything in their path. But Egypt, despite surviving, was permanently weakened. Trade networks disappeared overnight. Luxury goods vanish from the archaeological record. The flow of tin stops. Bronze production collapses. Population declined dramatically. Some estimates suggest the eastern Mediterranean lost 60 to 90% of its people through death, displacement, and dispersal. Most strikingly, writing disappeared. Linear B, the script that Mycenaean scribes used to track palace inventories and religious offerings, was lost. It wouldn't be deciphered again until the 1950 seconds. Greece entered a dark age where literacy vanished for 3 centuries. This wasn't one civilization falling while others continued. This was systemic failure. The Bronze Age world was so interconnected that when critical nodes failed, everything collapsed together. When trade networks broke down, bronze production stopped. When bronze production stopped, military power evaporated. When military power evaporated, cities couldn't defend themselves. When cities fell, the administrative systems that required those cities ceased functioning. Scholars debate what triggered the cascade. Climate data shows severe drought across the region. The sea peoples appear in Egyptian records as destroyers. But were they cause or symptom desperate populations displaced by failing agriculture? Some argue the system had become too complex, too specialized, too fragile. Minor disruptions that earlier generations could have absorbed became catastrophic. The truth is, probably all of these. A perfect storm. Drought stressing agricultural systems. Populations migrating as food ran short. Trade disrupted by unrest. Each failure triggering others. Complexity transforming from strength to fatal vulnerability. What came after was drastically simpler. Smaller communities, local production, no writing, no monumental architecture, no international diplomacy. The technologies and knowledge of the Bronze Age palace administration, sophisticated metallurgy, long-distance trade coordination were lost. For those who lived through it, or whose grandchildren heard the stories, it must have seemed like the world itself had ended. The age of great kingdoms had closed. Darkness had come. The wheel had turned. Just as the ancients said it would. The Maya built pyramids that touched the sky, developed mathematics that mapped eternity, and created calendars that predicted the end of ages. Then their cities fell silent, swallowed by jungle, as if the reset they predicted had come for them first. Between 800 and 900 CE, something went terribly wrong in the Yucatan. The classic Maya civilization, which had flourished for centuries, entered a death spiral from which it never recovered. Before the collapse, Maya cities rivaled anything in the ancient world. Tikal's towering pyramids dominated the jungle canopy. Copan's hieroglyphic stairway contained the longest known Maya text, documenting royal dynasties and cosmic cycles. Palenque's palace complex showcased architectural sophistication that still impresses engineers. These weren't primitive settlements. They were urban centers with populations in the tens of thousands, supported by intensive agriculture that had transformed the landscape. Maya scribes recorded history in intricate hieroglyphs carved into stone monuments. Astronomers tracked celestial cycles with precision that rivals modern calculations. Mathematicians developed the concept of zero independently. Artists created works of stunning beauty. Kings ruled through elaborate ceremonies that connected earthly power to cosmic order. Then the cities began dying. Not from invasion, not from conquest, from within. The last dated monument at Tikal was carved in 869 CE. At Copan, 822 CE. One by one, the great cities fell silent. Construction projects were abandoned mid-build. No more hieroglyphs were inscribed. The elaborate royal ceremonies stopped. Population dispersed into the surrounding countryside. When Spanish conquistadors arrived centuries later, they found ruins overtaken by jungle. The descendants of the Maya lived in small villages, their ancestors great cities unknown to them, consumed by forest. Archaeologists piecing together the collapse find evidence of cascading failures. Geological records show devastating drought lasting decades. Tree ring data confirms years of below-average rainfall precisely when the collapse accelerated. The Maya had engineered their environment to support large populations through intensive agriculture, terracing, irrigation, forest clearing. When drought came, the system couldn't adapt. Skeletal remains from the final decades show increasing malnutrition. Elite tombs become less elaborate, suggesting even the ruling class faced declining resources. Evidence of warfare increases fortifications built around cities, burned structures, unburied bodies. As food became scarce, the political system that had maintained peace fractured. City-states turned on each other. Perhaps most telling, the Maya ideology centered on kings who could communicate with gods and ensure cosmic order, bringing rain and prosperity. When drought persisted despite royal ceremonies, when harvests failed despite sacrifices, the entire basis of political legitimacy collapsed. Why follow kings who couldn't deliver what they promised? The Maya had survived droughts before. They'd weathered political crises. But this time, multiple stresses combined at a moment when the system had become too rigid, too specialized, too dependent on continued agricultural surplus to maintain its complexity. What makes the Maya collapse particularly haunting is that they had predicted it. Their cyclical calendars marked the ending of ages. Their cosmology described previous worlds destroyed and renewed. They understood the pattern, and when their turn came, the pattern held. The cities emptied, the jungle returned, knowledge was lost, population collapsed by an estimated 90%. The wheel had turned for them, just as their calendars said it would. Rome didn't fall in a day. It took centuries, generations of citizens watching their world slowly diminish, each adapting to a slightly smaller, slightly poorer, slightly more dangerous reality, until one day they looked around and realized the empire was gone. At its height in the 2nd century CE, Rome controlled every shore of the Mediterranean. The empire's roads connected Britain to Syria, Spain to Egypt. Aqueducts brought water to cities housing hundreds of thousands. Public baths, theatres, forums, urban amenities that wouldn't be matched again until the modern era. A single legal system, a common currency, relative peace across millions of square miles. If you were wealthy enough, you could travel from Hadrian's Wall to the Nile, speaking Latin or Greek the entire way, spending Roman coins, protected by Roman law. Then came the cracks. The crisis of the 3rd century brought 50 years of chaos, emperors rising and falling with dizzying speed, armies making and unmaking rulers, frontier defences crumbling, economy stuttering. Rome recovered, but changed. The empire divided into eastern and western halves. The capital moved from Rome to Constantinople. The unified system fragmented. Western Rome's decline played out across generations. Tax revenues dropped as provinces gained autonomy and kept wealth locally. Without tax revenue, the empire couldn't pay armies. Without paid armies, borders couldn't be defended. Germanic peoples displaced by migrations rippling across Eurasia pressed into Roman territory, sometimes as invaders, often as refugees seeking safety. Rome increasingly recruited these peoples into its legions. Gradually, the military became less Roman, its loyalties more complex. Economic strain deepened. Currency was debased, causing inflation. Trade networks that had connected the empire contracted. Cities dependent on long-distance grain shipments faced food insecurity. Infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, fortifications required constant maintenance. As resources dwindled, maintenance stopped, roads deteriorated, aqueducts broke, walls crumbled. For those living through it, collapse felt less like catastrophe than adaptation. Your grandfather remembered when the aqueduct worked. Your father remembered when grain arrived regularly. You remember when the legions were stationed nearby. Your children will remember when the villa was occupied, before your family retreated to a fortified farmhouse. Each generation accepts a slightly diminished reality as normal. In 476 CE, the last Western Roman emperor was deposed by a Germanic commander. But this wasn't the sudden end. It was just the formal acknowledgement of what had already happened. Power had already fragmented. The empire had already transformed into a patchwork of successor kingdoms, ruled by Germanic chiefs who claimed Roman titles and maintained Roman pretensions while presiding over something fundamentally different. What came after was dramatically simpler. Cities shrank to small towns or disappeared entirely. Literacy declined sharply outside monasteries. Long-distance trade collapsed into local exchange. Technologies were lost, the recipe for Roman concrete vanished, and wouldn't be rediscovered for over 1,000 years. Large-scale engineering became impossible. Rome's fall became Western civilization's foundational story of decline. Every later European understood history through Rome's shadow. The knowledge that even the mightiest empire can fade, that dark ages can follow golden ones, that the wheel turns for everyone. The pattern held. Even for Rome, every collapsed civilization shares the same autopsy report. They grew complex, specialized, interconnected. Then something stressed the system, and complexity, their greatest achievement, became the vulnerability that killed them. Modern scholars studying Bronze Age, Maya, Roman, and dozens of other collapses have identified a pattern so consistent it's almost a law. Civilizations follow predictable life cycles. They begin simply. Small communities with basic organization, limited specialization, local production. Everyone knows multiple skills. The system is robust because it's redundant. If one part fails, others compensate. Then comes growth. Population increases. Surplus production allows specialization. Some people become full-time craftsmen, others priests, others administrators. Trade networks develop. Technologies advance. Monumental architecture rises. Writing systems emerge to manage complexity. The civilization becomes more capable, more sophisticated, more impressive. But complexity has costs. Specialized systems require coordination. Trade networks need maintenance and protection. Bureaucracies require tax revenue to function. Elites expect increasing luxury. Military forces demand resources. Infrastructure needs constant upkeep. Each problem is solved by adding complexity, another layer of administration, another defensive fortification, another trade route. Eventually, the costs of additional complexity exceed the benefits. Archaeologist Joseph Tainter calls this diminishing returns on complexity. Early investments in organization produce huge gains. Later investments produce minimal gains while consuming massive resources. The system becomes fragile. When stress comes drought, invasion, economic disruption, disease, political crisis, complex systems can't adapt. Their specialization means few people know how to do essential tasks. Their interconnection means failures cascade. A disrupted trade route doesn't just inconvenience one city, it triggers shortages across the network. A failed harvest doesn't just affect farmers, it bankrupts the tax system, weakens the military, destabilizes urban centers. Collapse, when it comes, involves rapid simplification. Writing disappears because maintaining scribal schools is expensive and becomes impossible without surplus. Monumental architecture stops because coordinating large labor forces requires bureaucratic capacity that no longer exists. Trade networks fragment into local exchange. Population disperses from cities back to countryside. Specialized knowledge is lost as the institutions that preserved it collapse. What makes this pattern chilling is its universality. Bronze Age palaces, Maya cities, Roman provinces, later medieval kingdoms, all followed the same trajectory. Ancient observers watching kingdoms rise and fall around them would have noticed these regularities. Mighty empires grow corrupt and bureaucratic before collapsing. Environmental degradation precedes social breakdown. Internal divisions weaken societies before external enemies strike. Elites, capturing excessive resources, triggers legitimacy crises. The ancient concept of cyclical time wasn't mystical prophecy. It was sophisticated pattern recognition. They'd watched enough civilizations follow this trajectory to know it was inevitable. Growth leads to complexity. Complexity leads to fragility. Fragility leads to collapse. Collapse leads to simplification. Simplification allows new growth. The wheel turns. The pattern holds. The cycle continues. And recognizing this pattern, ancient peoples naturally asked, where are we in the cycle? For 2 million years, Earth has reset itself every 100,000 years. Ice advances, civilizations, if any exist, are erased. Ice retreats, the world begins again. We're living in cycle number 26. The question is, how much longer does this one last? The pattern is written in ice. Scientists drilling into the Antarctic ice sheet extract cores containing frozen time, compressed snow from hundreds of thousands of years ago, preserving chemical signatures of ancient atmospheres. Each layer tells a story, and the story repeats. Every 100,000 years, roughly, the planet transforms. Ice sheets, kilometers thick, spread across continents. Glaciers grind southward from the Arctic, covering what is now New York, London, Berlin, under impenetrable frozen mass. Sea levels drop by 120 meters as water is locked in ice. Coastlines extend far beyond their current positions. Land bridges emerge between continents. The global climate convulses into something barely recognizable. Then, after tens of thousands of years, The ice retreats. Seas rise. Climate warms. Life returns to previously frozen regions. The interglacial period begins a brief warm interval between frozen ages. We're living in one of these intervals right now. For the past 12,000 years, Earth has been relatively warm and stable. This stability allowed agriculture to develop, cities to rise, civilizations to flourish. Every human achievement, writing, mathematics, architecture, art, everything we consider civilization has occurred during this one warm interval. But the ice cores reveal something unsettling. Previous interglacial periods lasted roughly as long as ours has. Then the ice returned. The cause is cosmic. Milankovitch cycles, named for the Serbian scientist who calculated them, describe how Earth's orbit around the Sun isn't perfectly circular and stable. It wobbles. The planet's axial tilt varies between 22 and 24 degrees over 41,000-year cycles. The shape of our orbit shifts over 100,000-year cycles. These variations change how much solar radiation different parts of Earth receive, triggering ice ages and interglacials as predictably as clockwork. Ancient peoples couldn't have known about Milankovitch cycles. They didn't have ice cores or orbital mechanics, but they might have preserved something else. Memories from the last transition. 12,000 years ago, the ice began retreating. The process was dramatic. Seas rose rapidly as glaciers melted over the course of a few thousand years. Coastlines moved inland by hundreds of kilometers. Entire inhabited regions drowned. Continental shelves that had been dry land during the Ice Age disappeared beneath rising waters. If people lived through this, and they did, they remembered. Their grandchildren heard the stories. Those stories were passed down. And what would those stories describe? A world-drowning flood. Lost lands beneath the waves. A time before, when the world was different. A golden age that ended in catastrophe. Nearly every ancient culture has flood myths. We've assumed they were metaphorical or based on local river floods. But what if they're cultural memories of something real? The post-glacial sea level rise that transformed the entire planet? The ancient concept of cyclical ages, golden ages, ending in catastrophe, worlds being destroyed and renewed, might not be pure philosophy. It might be the deep memory of humanity's most recent brush with planetary reset. The ice came. The ice went. Everything changed. Our entire civilization exists in the brief warm pause between frozen worlds. And the ice always returns. The cycle never stops. Every 11 years, the sun's mood changes. Ancient astronomers noticed. They tracked it, alongside longer patterns, 88 years. 210 years cycles that brought drought, flood, famine, and renewal. They wondered, if the heavens move in cycles, why not human affairs? The sun isn't constant. Its surface churns with magnetic activity that waxes and wanes in predictable rhythms. Every 11 years, roughly, solar activity peaks. Sunspots multiply across the sun's face. Solar flares erupt. Radiation output fluctuates slightly. These variations are small but measurable, and they affect Earth. During periods of high solar activity, subtle shifts in climate occur. Some regions experience drought, others see altered rainfall patterns. Agricultural yields in certain areas vary predictably with the solar cycle. The impacts aren't dramatic enough to destroy civilizations, but they're significant enough to stress agricultural societies operating at the margins of sustainability. Ancient astronomers watched the sun carefully. Chinese astronomers recorded sunspots in detailed chronicles spanning centuries. They tracked unusual solar phenomena, noting correlations with earthly events. Without understanding the physics, they observed the pattern. The sun changes, and the world changes with it. But the 11-year cycle is just the beginning. Longer patterns emerge when you observe across generations. The Gleisberg cycle runs approximately 88 years, roughly a human lifetime. The Suez cycle stretches about 210 years beyond living memory, but observable across family lineages if records are kept. These longer cycles modulate the intensity of the shorter 11-year rhythm, creating periods of particularly active or particularly quiet solar behavior. Modern analysis of tree rings, which preserve chemical records of growing conditions, reveals climate variations matching these solar cycles. Good years and bad years, drought periods and wet periods don't occur randomly. They follow patterns. Ancient peoples living through these patterns would have noticed. Your great-grandfather remembered when the drought came. His great-grandfather told him it happened in his youth too. Stories accumulate. Patterns emerge. Every few generations, the same challenges recur. Harvests fail. Social stress increases. Conflicts emerge over resources. Then conditions improve. The cycle continues. Ancient civilizations incorporated these observations into their calendars and cosmologies. The Maya developed the long count calendar, tracking multiple overlapping cycles of different lengths. Hindu cosmology described nested cycles within cycles, shorter periods embedded in longer ones, all connected to cosmic rhythms. Chinese culture developed 60-year cycles combining celestial and earthly elements. These weren't arbitrary. They reflected genuine observation of recurring patterns. If you're an ancient priest keeping records across generations, you notice that certain problems recur predictably. Drought every few decades, political instability following environmental stress, recovery periods between crises. The patterns are subtle but real, and if the heavens themselves move in observable cycles, the sun changing its activity, celestial bodies following predictable paths, seasons returning in eternal rhythm, why wouldn't human history follow similar patterns? The logic is compelling. Everything observable moves in cycles. The day cycles into night. The moon waxes and wanes, seasons turn, the sun pulses. Agricultural yields fluctuate in multi-generational patterns. If all nature operates cyclically, it would be strange if human civilizations operated differently. The cosmos itself seemed to teach that time is circular, that patterns repeat, that what has been will be again. The ancient cyclical view of history wasn't mysticism. It was empiricism applied with the conceptual tools available. In 536 CE, the sun dimmed. Chronicles across the world described it. Darkness at noon, failing crops, famine, death. No one knew why. 2,000 miles away, a volcano had erupted. The world had reset, and those who survived wondered, when will it happen again? 74,000 years ago, Mount Toba in Indonesia exploded in one of the largest volcanic eruptions Earth has experienced. The blast released so much ash and gas into the atmosphere that global temperatures plummeted. Volcanic winter descended. Some scientists believe humanity nearly went extinct. Genetic analysis shows a bottleneck in human DNA around this time, suggesting our population crashed to perhaps a few thousand individuals. If any cultural memory of this survived across 70,000 years, it would appear in our deepest myths as the time the world nearly ended. More recently, around 1600 BCE, Thera, the island we now call Santorini, exploded. The Minoan civilization, which had flourished on Crete for centuries, collapsed shortly after. The eruption was catastrophic. The island's center collapsed into a caldera. Tsunamis swept across the Mediterranean. Ash darkened the sky. Plato, writing over 1,000 years later, described Atlantis sinking beneath the waves. He might have been preserving a distorted memory of Thera's destruction. In 79 CE, Vesuvius buried Pompeii and Herculaneum. In 180 CE, the Hatepe eruption in New Zealand devastated Maori settlements, preserved in oral histories as fire from the mountain. But the most globally impactful eruption in recorded history might be the one from 536 CE. Tree ring data and ice cores confirm what Byzantine, Chinese, and Irish chronicles all describe. The sun dimmed for 18 months. Snow fell in summer. Crops failed across the northern hemisphere. Famine spread. Populations weakened by hunger became vulnerable to disease. The plague of Justinian emerged during this period, killing millions. The eruption was likely Ilopango in El Salvador, though the exact source remains debated. What matters is the impact. A volcanic event on one side of the planet caused civilizational stress everywhere. For people experiencing it, the world appeared to be ending. In 1257, Samalas in Indonesia erupted with such force that it affected global climate for years. Social changes rippled across continents. Then, in 1815, Tambora, also in Indonesia, created the Year Without Summer. 1816 saw frost in July. Failed harvest globally, riots over food prices. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein during the dreary, sunless summer, trapped indoors by persistent storms. Volcanic eruptions are irregular but inevitable. Any ancient civilization existing long enough would experience or hear stories about such catastrophes. The sky darkening, crops failing, cold in summer, mass death. These events would be interpreted through available frameworks: gods warring in heaven, divine punishment, the end of an age. Without understanding volcanic mechanics, how else would you explain the sun disappearing and the world freezing? The pattern ancient peoples observed wasn't wrong. The earth does periodically reset through fire from below. Mountains explode. The atmosphere darkens. Civilizations struggle or collapse. Survivors rebuild. The cycle continues. The question isn't whether another major eruption will occur. The question is when, and whether we'll be any better prepared than our ancestors. 12,000 years ago, something from space struck North America. The climate convulsed. Megafauna died. Humans nearly didn't survive. Ancient stories remember this as the time fire fell from heaven and the world changed. It will happen again. It always does. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests that around 12,900 years ago, a comet or asteroid exploded over North America. The airburst triggered rapid climate cooling, reversing the warming trend that had been melting the Ice Age glaciers. Temperatures plunged. Massive animals, mammoths, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats went extinct. Human populations across North America collapsed. The hypothesis remains debated among scientists, but the climate change itself is undisputed. Something caused temperatures to drop suddenly and dramatically. Whether cosmic impact or other mechanisms, the event was catastrophic. If humans preserved memories of this, they would describe fire from the sky, the world burning, then freezing, the great animals disappearing, the time everything changed. We don't need to hypothesize about more recent impacts. We have direct observations. In 1908, something exploded over Tunguska in Siberia. An asteroid or comet fragment airburst several kilometers above the forest, releasing energy equivalent to 10 to 15 megatons of TNT. The blast flattened 80 million trees across 2,000 square kilometers. Witnesses, hundreds of kilometers away, saw the sky ignite. Shock waves circled the Earth twice. If Tunguska had occurred over Moscow or any populated area, hundreds of thousands would have died instantly. As it was, the remoteness of the impact site meant few casualties, but the event demonstrated what cosmic impacts can do. In 2013, a smaller meteor exploded over Chelyabinsk, Russia. The shockwave shattered windows across the city. Over 1,500 people were injured, mostly by flying glass. Videos captured the event from dozens of angles, a brilliant fireball crossing the sky in daylight, then a massive explosion. These modern events help us interpret ancient accounts. Chinese chronicles describing stars falling and causing destruction. Roman historians recording meteors presaging disasters. Indigenous oral histories across continents describing cosmic fires and devastation. These weren't metaphors. They were observations. Ancient astronomers tracked comets and unusual celestial phenomena. They noted their appearances, interpreted them as omens. They weren't necessarily wrong. A large comet on a collision course with Earth would appear as a spectacular celestial display before impact. Modern astronomy reveals that Earth exists in a cosmic shooting gallery. Small meteors burn up in our atmosphere constantly. Larger objects capable of causing local damage arrive every few centuries. Civilization-threatening impacts occur every few millennia. Dinosaur killer-scale events happen every few million years. The pattern is clear. Impacts are irregular but inevitable. Ancient peoples witnessing impact events or hearing stories from those who did would incorporate them into their understanding of how the world works. Gods throwing thunderbolts, the sky falling, fire from heaven, stars warring. These mythological images might preserve actual observations of cosmic catastrophes. The ancients understood something we sometimes forget. The cosmos isn't passive background. It actively intervenes in Earth's affairs. And when it does, worlds end and begin again. The cycle continues. From above and below, the resets come. Ancient kings decreed debt forgiveness every generation. They understood something we keep forgetting. Debt compounds until it destroys society, and periodically, the system must reset. We're $30 trillion into our cycle. The question is, how does this one reset? In ancient Mesopotamia, kings routinely issued edicts called declarations of freedom. All debts cancelled. Sold land returned to original families. People enslaved for debt liberated. The economic slate wiped clean. This wasn't charity or religious sentiment. It was practical governance. Here's why it was necessary. In agricultural societies, bad harvests happen periodically. When crops fail, farmers borrow seed grain to plant next year. If next year's harvest is also poor, they borrow more. Debt accumulates. Eventually, farmers who can't repay lose their land. which is taken by creditors. Some sell themselves or family members into servitude to settle accounts. As this process continues across generations, more land and labor become locked in debt relationships. Fewer free farmers exist to pay taxes or serve in armies. Wealth concentrates among creditors. The social foundation weakens. Eventually, the entire system becomes unstable. Ancient kings understood this dynamic. Periodic debt cancellation prevented the system from collapsing into permanent hereditary inequality. It was a reset mechanism built into governance. The biblical Jubilee laws prescribed the same thing. Every 49 or 50 years, debts cancelled, land returned, slaves freed. A generational economic reset, ensuring no family remained permanently dispossessed. Modern economies follow similar patterns. Economist Nikolai Kondratiev identified long-wave cycles in capitalist economies lasting roughly 50 to 70 years. Ray Dalio's work on debt cycles describes the same mechanism. Ancient kings observed. Debt grows during expansion periods, eventually exceeds productive capacity to service it, reaches unsustainable levels, triggers crisis and deleveraging. The pattern repeats throughout history. The Great Depression was a debt cycle crisis. The 2008 financial crisis followed the same script. Look back further, and you find regular financial panics and crashes occurring with rough periodicity. 1837, 1873, 1929, 2008, about 70 to 80 years apart. Why this duration? It's roughly a human lifetime. People who experience the last crisis die or lose influence by the time the next builds. Lessons are forgotten. The same mistakes seem like new ideas. Young people entering the economy don't remember when excessive debt led to catastrophe, so they embrace leverage enthusiastically. The cycle begins again. There's also mathematical inevitability. Debt compounds. If debt grows faster than the economy's capacity to produce, which it does during boom periods, eventually the mathematics become unsustainable. Something must give. Ancient observers watching periodic economic collapses and renewals would have incorporated this into their cyclical worldview. The pattern was observable. Periods of prosperity, growing inequality, crisis, reset, renewal. It happened repeatedly. We're currently deep in our own debt cycle. Government debt, corporate debt, household debt, all at historically high levels. The last major crisis was 2008, 16 years ago. Before that, the Great Depression in 1929, 79 years earlier. If the pattern holds, we're approaching another inflection point. The question isn't whether the cycle resets. The question is how. Through default, inflation, explicit cancellation, or some combination. The wheel turns. The debt compounds. The reset comes. It always does. The Greeks watched their cities cycle from democracy to tyranny to chaos and back. The Chinese watched dynasties rise and fall like seasons. They all concluded the same thing. No political system lasts. Power concentrates, corrupts, and collapses. The cycle begins again. Polybius, the Greek historian observing Rome's rise, mapped out what he called anacyclosis, the cycle of governments. Monarchy degenerates into tyranny as power corrupts. Tyranny becomes intolerable, sparking revolution that establishes aristocracy rule by the best. Aristocracy gradually becomes oligarchy as the ruling class prioritizes self-interest. Oligarchy provokes rebellion, leading to democracy rule by the people. Democracy degenerates into mob rule and chaos as factions compete for power. Finally, chaos becomes so unbearable that people accept a strong monarch to restore order, and the cycle begins again. This wasn't abstract philosophy. Polybius watched it happen. Greek city-states had cycled through these forms across generations. Rome itself was transforming from republic toward empire during his lifetime. Halfway across the world, Chinese political theory described similar cycles. The mandate of heaven explained dynastic succession. A virtuous founder receives heaven's blessing, establishes just rule, brings prosperity. His descendants gradually lose virtue, become corrupt, lose the mandate. Rebellion succeeds because heaven withdraws support. A new dynasty rises with a new mandate. The cycle continues. Chinese historians documented this pattern repeating. Unified empire, corrupt dynasty, fragmentation into warring states, reunification under new dynasty. Over and over. Ibn Khaldun, the 14th century Islamic scholar, theorized about dynastic cycles with remarkable sophistication. A vigorous group with strong social cohesion conquers and establishes rule. They achieve prosperity but become urbanized, comfortable, soft. They lose the original toughness and unity that brought them to power. Eventually they become vulnerable to conquest by a new vigorous group from the margins. The cycle takes approximately 4 generations: founders who struggled, successors who consolidated, descendants who enjoyed, final generation that lost everything. The pattern appears across cultures because it reflects something fundamental about power and human nature. Systems of governance arise to solve problems. Initially, they work well. Over time, they become entrenched, sclerotic, serve the interests of insiders rather than the common good. Legitimacy erodes. Crisis emerges. The system either reforms or collapses. Rome cycled from kingdom to republic to empire to fragmented kingdoms. France moved from absolute monarchy to revolution to empire to republic. China unified and fragmented and reunified repeatedly across 3,000 years. Modern political science recognizes similar dynamics. Democracies can decline into oligarchy as wealth concentrates and translates into political power. Crises sometimes produce autocratic responses. Systems periodically require renewal through reform or revolution to remain functional. No political form is permanent. Each contains seeds of its own transformation. Power concentrates. Corruption follows. Legitimacy decays. Eventually, the contradictions become unsustainable. The Greeks were right. The Chinese were right. Ibn Khaldun was right. Political systems cycle through predictable forms, driven by the same human dynamics across different cultures and centuries. The pattern holds. The cycle continues. Every 80 years, the length of a long human life, society forgets. The generation that survived crisis dies. Their grandchildren, having never experienced catastrophe, make the same mistakes. And the cycle repeats: stability, awakening, unraveling, crisis, rebirth. Strauss and Howe, studying American history, noticed something striking. Major transformative crises occurred with predictable regularity approximately every 80 to 90 years. The Revolutionary Crisis, around 1776. The Civil War Crisis, in the 1860 seconds. The Great Depression and World War II Crisis, from 1929 to 1946. They developed a theory. History moves in cycles driven by generational replacement. 4 generational archetypes emerge in sequence, each shaped by the historical period of their youth. These generations move through life, creating predictable social dynamics. The pattern unfolds in 4 turnings, each lasting roughly 20 years. First comes the high post-crisis stability. Institutions are strong, community-oriented values dominate, consensus about proper social arrangements exists. People who survived the crisis build new systems. Then comes the awakening spiritual and cultural upheaval. The generation raised in the comfortable high rebels against institutional conformity, seeking meaning and authenticity over material security and social order. The 1960 seconds counterculture was an awakening. Next comes the unraveling institutional decay and radical individualism. Trust in institutions collapses. Society fragments. People pursue personal interests over collective good. Government and civic institutions weaken. The late 1980 seconds through early 2000s exemplified this. Finally comes the crisis major upheaval requiring collective action. Wars, revolutions, economic collapse. Society either pulls together and renews institutions or fails catastrophically. We emerge, transformed, entering a new high, and the cycle begins again. Why does this happen? Generational memory loss. People who experienced the last crisis viscerally, who lived through depression, war, or revolution, build systems to prevent recurrence. They value stability, sacrifice for the common good, maintain institutions. Their children hear the stories but didn't experience the terror. They respect the institutions but take stability for granted. Their grandchildren know only abstract history. The crisis is ancient history, irrelevant to their lives. The institutions their grandparents built seem outdated, oppressive, unnecessary. By the time the great-grandchildren are making decisions, all living memory of the last crisis has vanished. The mistakes that led to catastrophe seem like fresh ideas. The warnings seem like paranoia from old people afraid of change. and so the cycle repeats. 80 years long enough for everyone who remembered to die. This pattern isn't unique to America. Similar cycles appear in other societies. Ancient observers noticed generational change. Greek myths distinguishing generations of gods and heroes, Chinese concepts of declining virtue across generations, biblical patterns of faithful generations followed by rebellious ones. If the pattern holds, we're currently in a crisis period. The last crisis ended around 1946, 78 years ago. Few people alive remember World War II vividly. Fewer still remember the Depression. We've forgotten. The mistakes look new. The warnings sound like overreaction. The wheel turns. The generations replace each other. The memory fades. The crisis comes. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Every 80 years, we discover why. The Romans built concrete structures still standing today. The formula was lost for 1,000 years. When civilizations collapse, they don't just lose power, they lose knowledge. And sometimes, they don't get it back. Roman concrete, used in the Pantheon, aqueducts, harbors, was stronger and more durable than most modern concrete, particularly in seawater. The recipe involved volcanic ash mixed with lime and seawater, creating a chemical reaction that strengthened over time. After the Western Roman Empire collapsed, this knowledge vanished. It wasn't rediscovered until the 20th century. Greek fire, the Byzantine Empire's secret weapon, a flammable substance that burned on water, devastating enemy fleets, was lost when the empire fell. The formula remains unknown today despite centuries of attempts to recreate it. Ancient texts describe surgical procedures not practiced again until the modern era. Sophisticated astronomical instruments whose construction methods were forgotten. Mathematical techniques that had to be independently rediscovered centuries later. Technological knowledge is fragile. It requires continuous transmission through skilled practitioners, institutions that preserve and teach techniques, social contexts where the technology remains useful and valued. Break any of these links, and knowledge disappears. When civilizations collapse, they lose more than political unity. They lose the institutional infrastructure that maintains specialized knowledge. Palace schools close. Guild systems dissolve. Libraries burn. The few remaining experts can't find students or resources to continue their work. Within a generation or two, complex techniques exist only as incomprehensible text or silent ruins. The transition from late antiquity to the early Middle Ages involved massive knowledge loss. Latin literacy declined sharply. Greek became unknown in Western Europe. Libraries were destroyed or abandoned. Sophisticated Roman engineering techniques constructing multi-story buildings, maintaining road networks, operating complex water systems were lost. Cities that had housed hundreds of thousands shrank to small towns, unable to maintain Roman infrastructure. The Maya collapse involved loss of hieroglyphic literacy. After the cities were abandoned, no one could read the inscriptions carved by their ancestors. The knowledge was recoverable, the inscriptions existed, but the cultural context that made them readable had vanished. The Bronze Age collapse erased Linear B script. Palace administration techniques disappeared. Metallurgical knowledge was lost. Technology doesn't automatically progress. It can regress, stagnate, vanish. Progress isn't a law, but a contingent achievement, requiring specific conditions. This creates cyclical patterns. Societies accumulate knowledge during stable periods. They lose knowledge during collapse. They slowly rebuild during recovery. If conditions allow, they eventually surpass previous heights, only to potentially collapse again. Ancient peoples could observe this pattern. They found ruins of earlier civilizations with impressive architecture they couldn't replicate. They heard stories of lost capabilities. They watched their own societies lose knowledge during crises. Finding remnants of more advanced earlier civilizations would naturally lead to concepts of declining ages, a golden age when knowledge was greater, followed by progressive loss of capability. The awareness that knowledge can be lost, that previous civilizations had capabilities now vanished, would reinforce cyclical thinking. What was achieved before might be achieved again. What was lost might return. History moves in circles, not lines. The pattern holds even for knowledge itself. Your brain is a pattern-finding machine. It evolved to see cycles, seasons, migrations, or predators' behaviors. This saved your ancestors' lives. It also makes you see cycles everywhere, even when they don't exist. The question is, which historical cycles are real, and which are just your brain doing what brains do? Pattern recognition is fundamental to human cognition. Your brain constantly searches for regularities in sensory input, extrapolates from past experiences to predict future events, finds meaning in sequences and repetitions. You can't turn this off. It's how your brain works. This capability kept your ancestors alive. Recognizing that certain plants bloom in spring allowed them to predict when food would become available. Noticing that predators hunt at dawn and dusk helped them avoid becoming prey. Observing that storms follow certain cloud patterns gave them time to seek shelter. Tracking that game animals migrate along specific routes at specific times made hunting successful. Pattern recognition turns data into prediction. Prediction enables survival. But the same system that recognizes real patterns also generates false ones. You see faces in clouds, meaningful shapes in random arrangements, significance in coincidences. Your brain is so eager to find patterns that it finds them even in random noise. This applies to history. You notice when empires rise and fall, when economies boom and bust, when generations hold different values, when your life moves through phases. Your brain, doing what it evolved to do, extrapolates. Everything must cycle. Sometimes this extrapolation is correct. Seasons genuinely cycle. Agricultural yields follow weather patterns. Economic systems accumulate stress and release it periodically. These patterns are real, but sometimes you're seeing patterns that don't exist. You notice 3 empires that collapsed and forget the dozen that didn't. You remember the prediction that came true and forget the 10 that failed. Confirmation bias amplifies your pattern detection, making cycles seem more regular than they are. Cyclical thinking also provides psychological comfort. It makes history comprehensible rather than chaotic. It suggests that suffering has meaning, this too shall pass, and the wheel will turn toward renewal. During difficult times, believing that dawn follows darkness offers hope. The cycle provides order in what might otherwise seem random catastrophe. Different cultures independently developed cyclical cosmologies: eternal return, death and rebirth, regeneration, world's ending and beginning. These concepts appear worldwide, not necessarily because they're empirically accurate, but because they resonate with how human minds organize experience. Modern psychology confirms this tendency. Cognitive biases toward pattern recognition, narrative thinking that imposes story structures on events, the deep human need for meaning and order. These aren't flaws but features of human cognition. Here's the complexity. Sometimes the patterns are real. Economic boom-bust cycles follow identifiable mechanisms. Generational replacement creates predictable social dynamics. Agricultural societies face genuine seasonal cycles. Political systems accumulate contradictions that eventually require resolution. But sometimes the patterns are imposed. Your brain organizes random historical events into cyclical narratives because that's what brains do. The cycle exists more in your interpretation than in the events themselves. Cyclical thinking emerges from this interaction. Deep psychological tendencies meeting real observable patterns, creating frameworks that are neither pure illusion nor pure empirical observation. The question becomes, which cycles are driven by actual mechanisms and which are artifacts of how we think? Once you believe in cycles, you'll see them everywhere. Your brain will find the evidence. Remember the confirming cases. Forget the exceptions. The question isn't whether you see cycles, you will. The question is, are they real, or are they just how your brain organizes randomness? Confirmation bias is powerful and automatic. Once you believe in cyclical patterns, you selectively attend to supporting evidence. Events that fit the cycle seem significant. Events that don't fit become exceptions, anomalies, timing variations. The cycle itself remains unquestioned. Someone who believes in 80-year crisis cycles will emphasize conflicts, crashes, and upheavals that occur near the predicted dates. Events that don't fit the timeline, major wars or depressions occurring at other times, get explained away or reinterpreted until they somehow confirm the pattern. Hindsight bias makes this worse. Once an event occurs, you reinterpret everything leading up to it as inevitable progression toward that outcome. The cycle seems obvious in retrospect. You forget how uncertain and unpredictable events seemed when they were actually unfolding. This creates an illusion of regularity. Looking backward, patterns seem clear and predictable. Living forward, they're much messier. Ancient peoples predicted resets based on cyclical theories. Some predictions seem to come true. But were those predictions accurate? Or do we just remember the hits and forget the misses? The availability heuristic distorts perception further. Dramatic collapses are memorable. The Bronze Age collapse, Rome's fall, the Maya abandoning their cities, these events are vivid and easily recalled. But long periods of stability are boring and forgettable. Civilizations that didn't collapse don't make it into the narrative. This creates distorted perception. Catastrophic endings seem more common than they actually are. You remember the empires that fell, forget the societies that transformed gradually or simply continued. Narrative bias compounds everything. Humans think in stories. Stories need structure, beginning, middle, end. Cyclical narratives provide satisfying arcs: rise, peak, fall, renewal. Your brain wants to impose this structure on historical events, even when the events don't actually follow that pattern. These biases work together, reinforcing each other. Pattern recognition identifies possible cycles. Confirmation bias emphasizes supporting evidence. Hindsight bias makes patterns seem inevitable. Availability heuristic overweights dramatic events. Narrative bias creates coherent stories. Ancient scholars were subject to these same biases. So are modern theorists about economic cycles, political patterns, and generational dynamics. So are you. Distinguishing real patterns from cognitive artifacts requires discipline. Look for specific mechanisms explaining why the pattern occurs. Test predictions prospectively rather than fitting patterns to past events. Consider alternative explanations. Acknowledge ambiguous cases. Some historical cycles are real, driven by identifiable mechanisms, debt dynamics, generational replacement, resource depletion, but our perception of cycles is amplified by cognitive biases that make patterns seem more pervasive and regular than they actually are. Your brain will find the cycles. The question is whether they're really there. If everyone believes the economy will crash, they panic. Their panic crashes the economy. The prophecy fulfilled itself. Ancient peoples predicted resets. Did those predictions simply observe patterns, or did believing in the reset help create it? Self-fulfilling prophecies complicate our evaluation of cyclical theories. If enough people believe a crisis is coming, their actions based on that belief can create the predicted event. Economic history provides clear examples. If investors believe a recession is approaching, they reduce spending and investment. Their collective pullback reduces economic activity, potentially triggering the recession they feared. If people believe a currency will collapse, they abandon it, causing actual collapse. If depositors believe a bank is failing, they withdraw funds, causing the bank to actually fail. The belief creates the reality it predicts. This operated in ancient contexts too. If a society believed they were entering a prophesied age of decline, behavior might shift in ways that produced actual decline. Elites might become more extractive, securing resources before the predicted end. Citizens might reduce cooperation and civic engagement. Social cohesion might weaken. These behavioral changes, motivated by prophecy, create conditions for actual collapse. Maya elites during the late Classic period might have intensified resource extraction as environmental stress made them believe crisis was approaching. This intensification could have accelerated the collapse they feared. Roman citizens losing faith in imperial institutions withdrew support, weakening those institutions further. Medieval Europeans expecting apocalypse made economic decisions reflecting short time horizons. The prophecy doesn't passively predict an independent future. By changing behavior, it participates in creating that future. This complicates everything. Were ancient cyclical theories accurate predictions of inevitable patterns, or did belief in the patterns help create them? The answer might be both simultaneously. Modern examples continue this pattern. Economic theories about business cycles shape expectations and behaviors, potentially creating the cycles they describe. Political theories about democratic decline might reduce civic engagement, contributing to actual decline. Generational theories might become self-fulfilling, as people act according to generational stereotypes. Even if cyclical patterns aren't inevitable, believing in them makes them more likely to occur. This doesn't mean cycles are purely illusory. Underlying mechanisms might exist independent of belief-debt dynamics that create boom-bust patterns regardless of whether anyone expects them. Resource depletion that produces collapse, whether predicted or not. Real structural factors can generate genuine cycles. But we can't simply observe whether cyclical predictions come true and conclude the theory is accurate. The predictions themselves influence outcomes. We're measuring something that changes when observed, like quantum mechanics but for history. The relationship between prophecy and reality becomes circular. Beliefs shape actions. Actions create events. Events confirm beliefs. The cycle reinforces itself not just through repetition, but through the self-fulfilling nature of cyclical expectations. Ancient peoples predicted resets. Sometimes resets occurred, but we'll never know how many of those resets were inevitable, and how many were partly created by people acting as if they were inevitable. The prophecy and the pattern become inseparable. Maybe ancient cyclical theories weren't primarily about prediction. Maybe they were about hope, a way to say this darkness will end when evidence suggested otherwise. Maybe they were frameworks for making catastrophe comprehensible and endurable. Cyclical beliefs serve psychological and social functions independent of their empirical accuracy. If your civilization is collapsing, believing this is part of a natural cycle offers profound comfort. The collapse isn't unique failure or divine punishment for your specific sins. It's a phase, a season, part of the eternal wheel turning as it always has and always will. After winter comes spring. After destruction comes renewal. This isn't just individual comfort but social cohesion. Shared cyclical beliefs create common understanding of events. They provide vocabulary for discussing change. They offer frameworks for coordinating responses to crisis. Everyone understands where they are in the cycle and what might come next. Cyclical thinking also affects political legitimacy. Dynasties claimed they were restoring a lost golden age. Reformers promised renewal after decline. Revolutionaries framed their actions as necessary destruction before rebirth. The cycle justified change. Chinese rebels claimed the reigning dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven. The cycle authorized rebellion and new beginning. Hindu reformers used Yuga theory to explain social problems and justify changes. Christian millenarians used apocalyptic cycles to motivate moral reform. The cycle legitimized transformation that might otherwise seem threatening. Cyclical frameworks can inspire action. If you believe renewal is possible and perhaps inevitable, you might work toward it rather than accepting despair. If decline is temporary, you might resist rather than accommodate it. The cycle provides agency within pattern. This contrasts with alternatives. Pure progress narratives suggest continuous improvement, potentially creating complacency if things automatically get better. Why struggle? Pure decline narratives suggest inevitable deterioration, potentially creating fatalism if collapse is certain. Why resist? Cyclical narratives offer middle ground. The current phase is temporary, but action during crisis influences the nature of renewal. You can't prevent the turn, but you might shape what comes next. This framework is neither complacent nor fatalistic but engaged. Different cyclical traditions shaped responses differently. Hindu philosophy accepted the current yuga while emphasizing that actions affect karma and future cycles work for good within acceptance of the larger pattern. Christian apocalypticism created urgency for moral reform before the ending. Greek philosophical thought combined resignation to cosmic cycles with commitment to virtue within them. Cyclical beliefs might be adaptive regardless of empirical accuracy. They help societies process change, maintain hope during difficulty, legitimate necessary transformations, coordinate collective action. These functions explain why cyclical thinking appears across cultures and persists across time. Perhaps asking whether ancient cyclical theories were empirically correct misses something important. Perhaps the better question is, did they help societies navigate actual changes? Did they provide frameworks that made catastrophe comprehensible and endurable? The answer, looking at how widely and persistently humans embraced cyclical thinking, might be yes. Function explains persistence better than accuracy. Modern complexity science confirms what ancient peoples observed. Civilizations grow complex. Optimization creates fragility. Small stresses can trigger catastrophic collapse. The ancients called it fate. Scientists call it phase transition. Both recognize the same pattern. Complexity theory studies systems with many interacting components, weather, ecosystems, economies, civilizations. These systems behave in ways that seem almost alive. They self-organize, they adapt, they achieve stability, and sometimes they suddenly collapse. Complex systems share characteristic behaviors. They can exist in multiple stable states. They undergo rapid transitions between states. Small changes can sometimes cascade into massive effects. The butterfly effect isn't just metaphor, but mathematical reality. And critically, they can experience sudden catastrophic failure from accumulated stress that seemed manageable until it suddenly wasn't. Civilizations are complex systems. Economic production, political institutions, social norms, environmental conditions, technological capabilities, all interconnected, all influencing each other. Normally, feedback mechanisms maintain stability. Problems arise, solutions emerge, balance restores, but complexity creates vulnerability. Joseph Tainter studied this systematically. Societies solve problems by becoming more complex. Facing food shortages, they develop irrigation systems. Managing larger populations, they create bureaucracies. Defending territory, they build standing armies. Each solution works, but adds complexity, more specialized roles, more institutions, more coordination required. Early increases in complexity produce enormous benefits. The returns are massive, but eventually, diminishing returns set in. Additional complexity costs more than it delivers. The system becomes expensive to maintain, requiring constant resource input just to stay functional. Meanwhile, optimization for current conditions creates fragility. Systems become precisely adapted to existing circumstances, efficient but inflexible. When conditions change, specialized systems can't adapt quickly. Redundancy has been eliminated as wasteful. Backup systems are expensive luxuries. Everything runs lean and optimized. Then, stress arrives. Drought, economic disruption, military pressure, disease. The system can't absorb the shock because all slack has been eliminated. Failures in one component propagate through interdependencies. Cascading collapse begins. This explains the pattern ancient peoples observed. Growth, increasing sophistication, apparent strength, sudden catastrophic failure. Peter Turchin applies these frameworks to historical data, finding mathematical patterns in civilizational dynamics. Jared Diamond examines environmental factors in collapse. Their work reveals specific mechanisms rather than mystical forces, but the patterns match what ancient observers described. Societies naturally tend toward increasing complexity during stable periods. They reach diminishing returns where complexity becomes burden rather than benefit. They optimize in ways that reduce resilience. They become vulnerable to perturbations they could previously absorb. When collapse comes, it involves rapid simplification. Specialized institutions disappear, trade networks fragment, populations disperse, knowledge is lost. Recovery eventually begins. Simplified societies start solving problems again. Complexity gradually rebuilds. The cycle can repeat. This framework differs from ancient theories in important ways. It emphasizes mechanisms over mysticism. It predicts patterns without claiming precise periodicity. It acknowledges that collapse isn't inevitable. Adaptation and transformation can prevent it. Historical contingency matters. Not all societies collapse, but the framework validates core aspects of ancient cyclical thinking. Societies really do follow patterns of growth, peak complexity, vulnerability, and simplification. Complexity itself creates conditions for eventual collapse. The pattern can repeat across multiple cycles. The ancients observed these patterns phenomenologically, explained them through available frameworks: cosmic necessity, divine judgment, moral decline. Modern science provides mechanistic explanations: systemic dynamics, diminishing returns, phase transitions. Different language, same pattern. The cycles are real. The mechanisms are now understood. The question remains: can understanding help us avoid repeating them? Scientists fed centuries of data into computers: population numbers, grain prices, elite competition, political violence. The computer found cycles roughly 200 to 300 years of growth, inequality, crisis, and reset. The pattern is real. The question is, can we break it? Cliodynamics treats history like physics. Collect data, build mathematical models, test predictions. Peter Turchin, a biologist turned historian, pioneered this approach. If ecology can be quantified, why not history? His team assembled massive data sets from historical records: population estimates, agricultural production, wages, wealth distribution, number of nobles competing for limited positions, instances of political violence, centuries of data, digitized and analyzed. Patterns emerged. Secular cycles approximately 2 to 3 centuries long, appearing across different societies and time periods. The mechanism is brutally simple. Population grows during stable periods. Eventually it presses against resource limits. More people competing for limited land and resources. Wages decline. Inequality increases. Life becomes harder for common people. Meanwhile, elite numbers grow even faster. Successful families have multiple children who expect elite status. Soon there are more elite aspirants than elite positions, more would-be nobles than noble estates, more university graduates than professional positions, more wealthy families than seats of power. Elite competition intensifies. Factions form. Political cooperation breaks down. Each faction seeks advantage over others. Stability erodes. Violence increases: riots, rebellions, civil wars, assassinations. Crisis eventually reduces both population and elite numbers. War, disease, famine, political purges. The process is brutal but effective. Population drops, elite ranks thin, competition eases, resources become more available relative to population, inequality declines. Recovery begins, population grows again, the cycle repeats. This pattern appears in medieval England and France, ancient Rome, Chinese dynasties, modern industrial societies. The periodicity varies, sometimes closer to 200 years, sometimes 300, but the dynamics remain recognizable. Turchin's models predicted current trends. In the 2010 seconds, based on data from previous decades, the framework anticipated increasing inequality and political instability. The prediction wasn't mystical but mathematical. The system was entering a crisis phase of a secular cycle. The periodicity roughly matches some ancient estimates. The mechanism, population dynamics, resource competition, elite conflict, provides empirical basis for what ancient scholars observed qualitatively. They watched kingdoms decay into civil war before renewal. They noticed the pattern. They lacked the mathematical framework, but recognized the cycle. Critics raise valid concerns. Historical data is incomplete and potentially biased. Correlations don't prove causation. Societies change in ways that might break historical patterns. Prediction in complex systems is inherently uncertain. But the patterns are statistically significant. Population cycles really do drive social dynamics. Inequality really does follow predictable trends. Political violence really does show cyclical patterns. These aren't psychological artifacts or confirmation bias. They're measurable regularities in historical data. The implications are profound. If these cycles are mechanistic, driven by fundamental population and resource dynamics, they might be modifiable through policy immigration to ease labor shortages, wealth redistribution to reduce inequality, expansion of elite positions to reduce competition. Or the patterns might be more robust than we'd prefer, driven by dynamics deeper than policy can easily change. The ancient question returns with mathematical precision. We see the cycle. We understand the mechanism. Can we escape it, or only watch it turn? Every 50 years, the economy transforms. New technology, new industries, old systems collapsing. Every 50 years, a generation learns what their grandparents knew, but their parents forgot that prosperity isn't permanent, and the ground can shift beneath the most solid-seeming systems. Nikolai Kondratiev, a Russian economist analyzing long-term data in the 1920 seconds, identified something strange. Economic activity seemed to move in waves much longer than normal business cycles. Not the familiar 7 to 10-year boom-bust pattern, but massive waves lasting 50 to 60 years from peak to peak. He proposed a mechanism. Clusters of innovations create new industries and opportunities. Investment floods toward these innovations. Infrastructure builds up around them. The economy expands for decades. Eventually, markets saturate. Returns diminish. Excess capacity accumulates. Recession and depression clear out inefficient businesses. The destruction creates space for the next wave of innovation. The historical sequence seems to support this. The Industrial Revolution, steam power, textiles, iron drove expansion from roughly 1,780 to 1,840. Then railroads and steel from 1,840 to 1,890. Electricity and chemicals from 1,890 to 1,940. Automobiles and mass production from 1,940 to 1,990. Information technology from 1,990 onward. Now perhaps renewable energy and biotechnology beginning their wave. Severe depressions appear during transitions. The 1,830 seconds and 1,840 seconds. The 1,880 seconds and 1,890 seconds. The 1,930 seconds. The 2008 financial crisis and subsequent stagnation might mark another transitional period. The theory remains controversial. Some economists see genuine long waves in the data. Others argue the patterns are artifacts we impose periodization retrospectively, finding cycles because we're looking for them. Technological change might not actually cluster so regularly, but even skeptics acknowledge something. Economic dynamics longer than typical business cycles do exist. Debt supercycles lasting 70 to 80 years. Technology, adoption curves, creating multi-decade growth periods. Demographic waves affecting labor supply and consumption patterns over generations. The approximate 50 to 60-year periodicity is striking. It's close to some ancient cycle estimates. It matches the working lifetime of a generation. It's long enough that institutional memory decays. This matters profoundly. If economic transformations occur every 50 years, most people experience only one complete cycle during their active economic life. Your grandparents lived through the Depression, learned caution, valued stability. Your parents grew up in post-war prosperity, didn't experience economic catastrophe, embraced leverage and risk. You're learning again, perhaps the hard way, that systems can fail. Each generation learns from experience, not history. The lessons forgotten across the generational gap must be relearned through crisis. This helps explain why similar economic mistakes recur despite previous experience. The pattern isn't conscious repetition but memory loss. The economy transforms. New technologies disrupt old industries. Fortunes built on previous paradigms evaporate. Workers discover their skills are obsolete. The ground shifts. Those who remember the last shift are too old to influence policy. Those making decisions grew up during stability and can't imagine fundamental change. Until it happens. Again, like clockwork, roughly every 50 years. The wheel turns. Climate doesn't follow political boundaries or human calendars, but it does follow cycles. Every few decades, the rains fail. Every few centuries, the temperature shifts. And civilizations depending on stored grain that isn't there, on rivers that don't flow, on harvests that don't come discover their fragility. Climate varies at multiple timescales. The sun's 11-year cycle affects solar radiation reaching Earth. Multi-decadal oscillations. The Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, Pacific decadal oscillation, shift ocean temperatures and global weather patterns every 20 to 30 years. El Niño southern oscillation creates recurring disruptions. Longer cycles appear in ice cores. Roughly 1500-year variations, centennial-scale solar output changes, millennial ocean circulation shifts. These cycles stress agricultural societies predictably. Regular droughts reduce harvests. Temperature variations shorten growing seasons. Precipitation changes affect water availability. The effects amplify through social systems. Crop failures trigger famines. Famines spark unrest. Unrest destabilizes governments. Paleoclimate research reveals moments when climate stress coincided with civilizational collapse. The 4.2 kiloyear event, severe drought around 2200 BCE, corresponds to simultaneous collapses in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley. The late Antique Little Ice Age, from 536 to 660 CE, brought crop failures, famines, and plagues during a period of political upheaval across Eurasia. The medieval warm period, followed by the Little Ice Age, coincided with European social transformations. Climate isn't deterministic. It creates stress. Societies respond with varying success. Some adapt, some collapse. But climate does provide recurring, predictable challenges. Ancient peoples could observe these patterns. Multi-generational drought cycles, periodic famines returning with rough regularity, climate variations that seemed patterned rather than random. Without understanding atmospheric physics, they noticed the recurrence. Climate cycles interact with social cycles in dangerous ways. Population grows during favorable climate periods. Societies expand to fill available resources. When climate deteriorates, and it does, cyclically, the larger population faces the same or smaller resource base. What was sustainable becomes unsustainable. Institutions developed during stable periods become maladaptive during stress. Agricultural techniques optimized for wet conditions fail during drought. Political systems, assuming adequate resources, fracture when scarcity emerges. The combination of climate stress and social vulnerability creates collapse conditions. Modern quantitative studies confirm correlations between climate variations and political violence. Temperature extremes increase conflict. Droughts correlate with rebellions. The mechanisms are understood. Resource scarcity creates competition. Competition generates conflict. Conflict destabilizes institutions. This provides a mechanism for roughly periodic civilizational crises. Climate cycles create recurring stress. Societies grow during favorable periods. They become vulnerable during stress periods. Collapse resets population and complexity to levels sustainable under new conditions. Recovery begins when climate improves. The periodicity isn't exact. Climate cycles of different lengths interact complexly. Social factors modulate responses. But the underlying reality remains. Climate varies cyclically, creating predictable, recurring challenges to agricultural civilizations. Ancient peoples watching these patterns unfold across generations naturally incorporated them into cyclical worldviews. The pattern wasn't imagined, it was observed. The wheel of climate turns, and human fortunes turn with it. The worst crises happen when cycles align, when economic collapse meets political breakdown meets climate disaster meets generational crisis. Individually manageable, together, catastrophic. Ancient peoples called these alignments the end of ages. They might have been tracking something real. Different cycles operate independently. Economic debt cycles run roughly 70 years. Generational cycles span 80 years. Political secular cycles take 2 to 3 centuries. Climate oscillations vary from decades to millennia. Most of the time, these cycles are out of phase. One system faces stress while others remain stable. The stable systems provide resilience, helping society absorb the shock. But sometimes rarely, but inevitably, the cycles align. Multiple stresses converge simultaneously, and the compound crisis becomes something qualitatively different from any single challenge. The 1,930 seconds and 1,940 seconds exemplify this convergence. Economic collapse, the Great Depression, was a debt cycle crisis, the culmination of 1,920 seconds credit expansion. Political breakdown, the international order established after World War I, fractured, democracies failed, authoritarian regimes emerged. Generational crisis, in Strauss-Howe terms, a fourth turning, when the generation that remembered the last crisis had died. Environmental stress, the Dust Bowl devastated. American agriculture, climate problems affected yields globally, all simultaneously. Each crisis worsened the others. Economic collapse fueled political extremism. Political conflict disrupted economic recovery. Environmental problems deepened economic stress. Generational memory loss meant societies repeated mistakes from previous crises. The convergence created a crisis multiplex, where problems reinforced each other catastrophically. The 6th century CE showed similar convergence. Climate stress from volcanic eruptions darkening the sky. Pandemic disease, the Justinian plague, killing millions. Political upheaval, Byzantine-Persian wars draining resources. Economic disruption, trade networks fragmenting. The ancient world transformed fundamentally. The Bronze Age collapse likely involved multiple converging factors. Climate drought, stressing agriculture. Sea peoples' migrations, creating military pressure. Economic complexity becoming unsustainable. Political systems losing legitimacy. Trade network interdependencies, creating cascading failures. No single factor was necessarily catastrophic, but their alignment proved overwhelming. Ancient observers would have noticed that some eras involved multiple simultaneous disasters, while other difficult periods involved isolated problems. They might have identified these convergences as the transitions between ages. When everything went wrong at once, that marked the end of one world and beginning of another. This framework affects predictability profoundly. Individual cycles might be somewhat forecastable. We can identify debt building unsustainably, political polarization increasing, generations replacing each other predictably. But their interaction is complex and chaotic. Precisely predicting when multiple cycles will align remains difficult. What we can do is identify periods of elevated risk. When multiple indicators show stress, high debt levels, political division, generational transition, climate instability, technological disruption, the probability of convergence increases. We can't predict the exact trigger or timing, but we can recognize when the system is vulnerable to compound crisis. Modern analysts attempt this now. Aging demographics in developed nations, unprecedented debt levels globally, political polarization intensifying, climate change creating recurring stresses, technological transformation disrupting employment and social structures. Each individually challenging, their potential convergence concerning. The worst resets don't follow any single cycle's schedule. They occur when multiple cycles align, creating rare but catastrophic convergences. The wheel of history doesn't turn on one axis but many, spinning independently until occasionally, inevitably they synchronize. Ancient philosophers sought a master cycle, one cosmic rhythm explaining all others, one great wheel turning all smaller wheels. Modern science has searched too, examining Earth's orbital variations, solar cycles, galactic rhythms. So far, the master cycle remains elusive. Perhaps it doesn't exist. The appeal is obvious. If one fundamental cycle underlies all others, history becomes comprehensible. Economic cycles, political cycles, climate cycles, civilizational cycles all synchronized to some cosmic pacemaker, ultimate order in apparent chaos. Ancient peoples proposed candidates. Plato's great year lasted approximately 26,000 years, one complete precession of the equinoxes, when Earth's axis completes its slow wobble and constellations return to their original positions. Hindu cosmology described the Kali Yuga, lasting 432,000 years before cosmic renewal. Maya long count tracked approximately 5,125-year cycles. Modern researchers have searched for master cycles too. The precession cycle genuinely exists. Earth's axis does wobble over 26,000 years, changing which pole star we see, altering the timing of equinoxes relative to Earth's orbit. Some researchers suggest this affects climate through subtle orbital changes, potentially influencing civilizational development. Others examine longer timescales. Earth's orbital eccentricity, how elliptical rather than circular our orbit is, varies over 100,000 and 400,000 year cycles. These drive Ice Age timing demonstrably. The solar system's passage through galactic arms might affect cosmic ray exposure every 60 million years, potentially influencing climate and evolution. Some historical theorists propose master cycles of 500, 1,000, or 2,000 years, suggesting all shorter cycles nest within these longer rhythms like Russian dolls. The problems are substantial. No proposed master cycle has compelling evidence for direct effects on human history at the claimed periodicity. Correlation doesn't prove causation. Just because two things cycle doesn't mean one drives the other. Historical events are contingent, path-dependent, influenced by human choices and random factors that don't follow cosmic schedules. Different aspects of history cycle at different rates. Economic patterns operate on decades, political patterns on centuries, ice ages on 100,000 years. They don't synchronize to any single pacemaker. Some astronomical cycles are undeniably real. Ice Age cycles follow orbital variations precisely. Solar activity cycles affect Earth measurably. The question is whether any operate at timescales and magnitudes relevant to human civilizational history over the last few thousand years. Most modern scholars are skeptical. Multiple independent cycles with different mechanisms seems more plausible than one cosmic rhythm. Historical patterns show too much irregularity for strict cyclical determinism. Contingency matters. Path dependence matters. Human choices matter. Yet the search continues. Something in human psychology craves ultimate explanation. We want one simple answer rather than many complex ones. One great wheel rather than many independent gears. Perhaps the master cycle's absence is itself meaningful. Reality is complex. History operates on multiple timescales simultaneously. Economic, political, generational, climate, and astronomical cycles all proceed independently, occasionally aligning, but never permanently synchronized. The cosmos doesn't organize human affairs around a single rhythm. The patterns are real, but they're plural, not singular. Many cycles, not one. Many wheels, independently turning. History repeats, but it also innovates. Empires rise and fall in familiar patterns, until suddenly, nuclear weapons change war forever. Economies boom and bust cyclically until suddenly, the Industrial Revolution changes production forever. Cycles are real. So is novelty. History is the tension between them. Some developments genuinely don't repeat. The scientific revolution fundamentally changed how humans understand and interact with nature. Nothing comparable had happened before. The method, systematic observation, experimentation, mathematical description, peer review created an entirely new relationship between humans and knowledge. This wasn't a cycle returning to previous patterns. It was genuine innovation. The Industrial Revolution created economic possibilities without precedent. Previous civilizations rose and fell within agricultural constraints. Malthusian dynamics limited population and production. Then suddenly, fossil fuels, machinery, factory production, economic capacity exploded beyond historical patterns. We haven't cycled back to pre-industrial conditions. We created something new. Nuclear weapons changed warfare's fundamental dynamics. Previous weapons differed in degree: sharper swords, longer bows, better cannons, but nuclear weapons differ in kind. The capacity for species-level destruction creates strategic calculations that didn't exist before. This changes conflict cycles potentially permanently. Digital technology creates social structures without historical precedent. Instant global communication, information abundance replacing information scarcity, social networks connecting billions, economic transactions at light speed. These aren't variations on previous patterns. They're novel conditions requiring novel adaptations. Contingency matters profoundly. Specific combinations of factors might occur only once. Gutenberg's printing press, plus Protestant Reformation, plus European exploration, created unique cultural transformation. That particular confluence won't repeat exactly. Individual choices alter trajectories. What if Alexander had turned back before reaching India? What if Genghis Khan had moved west instead of east? What if the Library of Alexandria had been preserved? Counterfactuals are unprovable, but they remind us that history isn't deterministic. Different choices create different paths. Unexpected innovations break patterns. Modern medicine broke disease cycles that previously recurred regularly. Smallpox, once a recurring scourge, was eradicated. The cycle permanently ended. Polio, cholera, plague, once cyclical, now controlled. Medical knowledge accumulated progressively, not cyclically. Agricultural innovations broke some Malthusian population cycles. The Green Revolution allowed population growth without corresponding famine. Synthetic fertilizer, improved crops, mechanization. These progressively changed human carrying capacity, rather than cycling through previous patterns. Even strong cycles can transform. Democratic innovations potentially modified political cycles. Peaceful power transitions replace violent succession. Constitutional constraints limit autocratic consolidation. These patterns might not eliminate political cycles entirely, but perhaps create less destructive versions. This creates tension between cyclical and progressive views. Political patterns seem genuinely cyclical, democracy degenerating to oligarchy, republics becoming empires. Economic dynamics show boom-bust patterns. Generational succession continues predictably. But technological knowledge accumulates progressively. Cultural evolution builds on previous developments. Scientific understanding grows rather than cycling. Historical reality involves both cycles and trends, patterns and unique events, repetition and genuine novelty. Randomness compounds unpredictability. Volcanic eruptions, epidemics, individual decisions can trigger or prevent crises unpredictably. Even if underlying cyclic tendencies exist, precise prediction remains impossible. Chaos theory demonstrates that deterministic systems can be unpredictable because small variations create large, divergent outcomes. Cycles represent tendencies, not laws. Patterns might be real, but not deterministic. Recognizing which aspects are cyclical and which are progressive requires careful analysis rather than assuming everything follows either pattern exclusively. History is neither pure repetition nor pure innovation. It's both simultaneously. The art is recognizing which is which. We can't eliminate all cycles. Seasons will still turn, generations will still succeed each other, complex systems will still face stress and adaptation. But maybe we can transform destructive cycles into constructive ones. Maybe the pattern continues, but its nature changes. Maybe that's the real escape. Different perspectives offer different answers. Fatalists suggest cycles are inevitable, attempts to escape them futile. The wheel turns regardless of human effort. Optimists suggest awareness creates opportunity for intervention. Understanding mechanisms allows modification. Moderates suggest cycles can be modulated but not eliminated. Evidence supports the moderate view. Some interventions seem partially successful. Keynesian economics explicitly attempts smoothing economic cycles through counter-cyclical policy, government spending during recessions, saving during booms. Business cycles since World War II have been less severe than 19th century panics and depressions. The pattern continues, but with reduced amplitude. Modern medicine has broken some disease cycles that previously recurred with deadly regularity. Smallpox eradicated, polio nearly eliminated, plague controlled. These cycles ended through deliberate intervention, not inevitability. Democratic institutions attempt channeling political conflict into peaceful succession rather than violent revolution. Not always successful, but where functioning, they create smoother transitions than purely cyclical succession through coup and counter-coup. Yet other patterns persist despite interventions. Debt cycles recur even with central bank management. Political polarization emerges cyclically despite institutional safeguards. Resource conflicts continue despite international cooperation frameworks. Some interventions might create new problems. Central bank interventions during downturns potentially create moral hazard and larger eventual crises. Medical interventions create antibiotic resistance and new disease challenges. Attempting to eliminate natural cycles sometimes generates artificial ones. Complexity theory suggests small interventions at critical points might shift system trajectories, the butterfly effect working in humanity's favor. But it also suggests that eliminating one pattern often creates different patterns rather than perfect stability. Perhaps the question isn't, can we escape all cycles? But can we create better cycles? Moving from destructive patterns, war, catastrophic collapse, violent revolution, to constructive patterns, peaceful transitions, orderly renewal, creative destruction, rather than chaotic destruction. Awareness itself might matter. If people recognize early warning signs, they might take preventive action. If societies understand mechanisms driving cycles, they might design institutions to modulate them. If generations learn from previous experiences rather than forgetting, patterns might gradually improve. The paradox is delicate. Too much belief in inevitability creates fatalism, preventing constructive action. Too much belief in control creates hubris, ignoring real constraints. The productive middle ground recognizes patterns while working to modify them. Seasons continue cycling, but agriculture transforms how we experience them. Generations continue replacing each other, but institutions preserve knowledge across transitions. Economic systems continue facing booms and busts, but interventions reduce their severity. Political systems continue evolving, but democratic innovations reduce violence. The cycles don't end, but their nature changes. The pattern continues, but the amplitude diminishes. The wheel turns, but perhaps we've learned to smooth its roughest edges. That might be the only escape available, not transcending cycles entirely, but gradually, incrementally, making them less destructive. Not perfection, but improvement. Not escape, but transformation. In temples across India, priests still mark time by the Yugas, 4 cosmic ages, currently the Kali Yuga, Age of Darkness. In New Mexico, Hopi elders still reference prophecies about purification and renewal. Ancient cycles aren't dead. For millions, they're the framework for understanding now. Hindu communities worldwide continue viewing time through Yuga theory. We live in Kali Yuga, the age of moral decline, spiritual ignorance, shortened lifespans, and increasing suffering. This isn't despair but context. Current difficulties make sense within the cosmic pattern. The Age of Darkness precedes renewal. What seems like endings are actually transitions. This framework shapes how traditional practitioners engage with modernity. Technological change and moral dissolution become evidence of Kali Yuga's characteristics rather than unprecedented crises. Some maintain traditional practices as anchors during chaos. Others interpret social reform as necessary preparation for eventual renewal. The cycle provides meaning where linear progress might suggest only decline. Indigenous cultures worldwide maintain cyclical cosmologies that never disappeared. Hopi prophecies describe purification and renewal cycles. Maori cosmology understands time as layered and circular rather than linear. Aboriginal Australian dreamtime transcends our categories of past and future entirely, everything happening simultaneously in eternal present while also cycling through transformations. For practitioners, these aren't relics, but living frameworks. They provide cultural continuity across generations. They offer alternative perspectives on progress and development. They maintain connection to ancestral wisdom. They create meaning during disruption that linear narratives struggle to accommodate. Buddhist teachings continue emphasizing cosmic cycles, kalpas spanning unfathomable time, universes arising and dissolving, endless succession of Buddha ages. Meditation traditions work with impermanence and cycles at every scale, from breath to cosmos. Tibetan teachings describe how different ages require different practices. Personal rebirth occurs within larger cosmic cycles of creation and destruction. Jewish and Christian apocalyptic traditions incorporate cyclical elements despite their generally linear theology. Rabbinic discussions explore world ages and messianic cycles. Christian millennialism identifies recurring patterns before Christ's return. Apostasy, tribulation, renewal. These frameworks shape how believers interpret contemporary events, finding present circumstances within prophesied patterns. These traditional beliefs differ fundamentally from conspiracy theories. They're rooted in ancient cosmologies integrated into coherent philosophical systems. They focus on spiritual meaning rather than political blame. They're generally more concerned with personal ethical response than grand narratives about hidden controllers. For practitioners, these aren't abstract beliefs, but lived frameworks. Ritual cycles mark cosmic time, daily prayers, seasonal festivals, life cycle ceremonies, all reflecting larger patterns. Ethical practices appropriate to the current age, maintaining virtue during Kali Yuga's darkness, preparing for coming transformations. Community solidarity around shared cosmological understanding. Hope sustained through cyclical framework, this darkness will pass, renewal will come. Modernization creates various responses. Some adapt traditional cycles to contemporary contexts, interpreting technological change through ancient prophecies. Others maintain traditional forms precisely as counterweight to modernity's disorienting speed. Diaspora communities use cyclical beliefs to preserve cultural identity across geographical displacement. Interaction with scientific knowledge creates accommodations or tensions depending on community and individual. The ancient cycles persist, not as museum pieces, but as functioning frameworks through which millions understand their lives and times. The wheel still turns in their cosmologies, and for them, this provides not fatalism but meaning. Historians map civilizations like physicians map disease, identify symptoms, track progression, predict outcomes. Some see cycles rise, flourish, decline, fall, repeating across civilizations. Others see unique stories. Both might be partly right. Arnold Toynbee spent decades examining civilizations not just Rome and Greece, but Sumerian, Egyptian, Chinese, Mayan, dozens of others. He found patterns: genesis through creative response to challenges, growth through increasing differentiation and coordination, breakdown when creative minorities become dominant minorities, disintegration through internal conflicts. Not identical trajectories, but recognizable dynamics. Oswald Spengler proposed something more organic. Cultures pass through seasons like living organisms. Spring the awakening, mythic beginnings, rural foundations, summer maturity, intellectual flowering, confident expansion, autumn urban civilization, sophisticated culture, philosophical reflection, winter decline into what he called civilization, rigid, mechanistic, spiritually exhausted. Each culture's seasons are unique, but the pattern repeats. William Strauss and Neil Howe examined American history specifically, identifying 4 repeating generational archetypes creating roughly 80-year cycles. Each generation's formative experiences shape their values. As generations move through life stages, they create predictable social dynamics, periods of building, awakening, unraveling, crisis, renewal. These frameworks attempt finding patterns without abandoning historical specificity. They recognize unique features of each civilization while identifying common dynamics. They use cycles as analytical tools rather than deterministic prophecies. They ground theories in extensive historical research rather than mystical cosmology. Academic historians view these theories with mixed appreciation and skepticism. Some value the pattern identification and comparative analysis. Others worry about grand theories oversimplifying complex history. The concern is that cyclical frameworks might impose patterns rather than discover them, seeing cycles because you're looking for them, ignoring evidence that doesn't fit. Yet these theories influence contemporary thought significantly. Strauss-Howe generational theory is widely cited in popular culture, business strategy, and political analysis. Toynbee's civilizational framework affects international relations thinking. Cyclical economic theories inform investment strategies and policy debates. The tension between cyclical and progressive historiography remains unresolved. Most academic history emphasizes contingency, unique contexts, specific decisions, particular circumstances. Cyclical theories emphasize patterns, repetition, regularity, predictability. Perhaps both capture aspects of reality. History might involve both patterns and particularity, cycles and contingency. Modern applications range widely in rigor. Business strategists use Kondratiev waves to time investments, sometimes with sophisticated analysis, sometimes with wishful pattern finding. Political analysts apply generational theory to understand polarization, sometimes illuminating, sometimes forcing complex dynamics into simplistic frameworks. Futurists use civilizational cycle theories for long-term thinking, sometimes productively, sometimes speculatively. These secular theories differ from traditional religious cycles in important ways. They're based on historical observation rather than cosmic principle. They're subject to empirical testing and revision. They focus on proximate mechanisms, demographics, economics, psychology rather than ultimate meanings. They're generally more tentative and provisional, acknowledging uncertainty. The debate continues. Are these patterns real or imposed? Do civilizations genuinely follow similar trajectories, or do we retrospectively construct similarities? Does generational succession create predictable dynamics, or is each generation's experience too unique for pattern finding? Perhaps the question isn't whether history is purely cyclical or purely unique, but how much pattern exists within variation, how much repetition within novelty. The search for cycles represents serious attempts to understand history systematically. Success is debated, but the effort isn't inherently flawed. Some see patterns in history and conclude we're trapped in cosmic cycles. Others see the same patterns and conclude someone is deliberately creating them. One leads to understanding, the other leads to paranoia. The difference is in how you think about causation. Legitimate observations about patterns can twist into conspiratorial narratives through subtle distortions. Financial crises recur due to credit dynamics and human psychology observable mechanisms. But this observation becomes secret cabals deliberately crash markets. Political cycles show democratic expansion, followed by authoritarian retrenchment systemic dynamics. This becomes elites' planned democracy's destruction. Technological change disrupts social structures, inevitable consequence of innovation. This becomes deliberate social engineering by hidden controllers. The shift from pattern recognition to conspiracy involves attributing systemic dynamics to intentional design. Emergent behavior arising from many actors pursuing individual interests gets reinterpreted as coordinated control. Complex causation gets simplified to hidden agents pulling strings. Conspiracy theories misuse cyclical frameworks in characteristic ways. They take approximate patterns and claim precise timing. The crisis will occur on this specific date. They attribute randomness to design. Coincidences become evidence. They make cycles deterministic rather than probabilistic. This must happen because the cycle demands it. They find malevolent intent in neutral mechanisms. Some interpretations of Mayan calendars predicted 2012 apocalypse by misunderstanding cyclical cosmology. Traditional Mayan understanding saw cycles as transitions, not endings. Conspiratorial appropriation turned transition into catastrophe and claimed special knowledge about exact timing. Some readings of Hindu Yugas predict imminent world destruction contrary to traditional timescales. Classical calculations place Kali Yuga's end hundreds of thousands of years ahead. Conspiratorial versions accelerate the timeline to create urgency and fear. Economic cycle theories sometimes twist into claims about planned collapse that crashes are deliberately engineered rather than emerging from credit dynamics and human behavior. The differences between legitimate analysis and conspiracy are clear. Legitimate analysis identifies mechanisms and acknowledges uncertainty. These dynamics tend to produce cycles with this approximate periodicity. Conspiracy theories attribute agency and claim certainty. They will cause collapse on this date. Scholarly work invites testing and revision. Conspiracy theories resist contradiction, expanding to accommodate any new evidence. The psychological appeal is obvious. Conspiracy theories provide simple explanations for complex events. They create clear villains to blame. They offer special knowledge and insider status you see what others miss. They give patterns to randomness. They provide community of shared believers reinforcing each other's interpretations. But the social dangers are real. Conspiratorial thinking can justify inaction. The cycle is inevitable anyway. Resistance is futile. It enables scapegoating. These people caused the crisis. It can motivate dangerous action. We must prevent the prophesied catastrophe through extreme measures. Distinguishing legitimate cyclical analysis requires attention to specific markers. Does it acknowledge uncertainty and contingency? Does it identify specific mechanisms rather than vague forces? Does it invite empirical testing? Does it recognize multiple causes? Does it avoid scapegoating? Are claims proportional to evidence? The existence of conspiracy theories doesn't invalidate legitimate pattern recognition. Real cycles exist in economic systems, demographic dynamics, climate variations. Simplified or conspiratorial interpretations don't make underlying patterns false. The challenge is maintaining rigorous thinking while acknowledging patterns. Productive engagement with cyclical thinking requires discipline. Study actual historical data. Understand mechanisms. Acknowledge uncertainties. Avoid determinism. Resist conspiratorial simplification. Use patterns to prepare rather than panic. The patterns are real. The mechanisms are understandable. The conspiracies are imaginary. Knowing the difference matters. Knowing that economic downturns recur doesn't mean accepting poverty. It means preparing, building resilience, timing action wisely. Knowing that political crises come in waves doesn't mean abandoning democracy. It means strengthening institutions before they're tested. Awareness is the first step to wise action. Understanding economic cycles informs counter-cyclical behavior. Save during booms when everyone else spends. Invest during busts when assets are cheap and pessimism peaks. Build reserves during abundance for inevitable scarcity. This isn't prophecy, but prudence based on pattern recognition. Central banks explicitly try moderating economic cycles through policy. Lower interest rates during downturns to stimulate spending. Raise rates during booms to prevent overheating. The success is debatable, but the attempt reflects cycle awareness informing action. Recognizing generational patterns improves intergenerational communication. Understanding that each generation's formative experiences shape values differently creates empathy rather than frustration. Institutions can design for generational succession rather than assuming current conditions persist permanently. Acknowledging political cycles motivates civic engagement during critical periods. If democratic backsliding follows predictable patterns, citizens can recognize early warning signs and respond before damage becomes irreversible. Cyclical thinking creates appropriate urgency without fatalism. Awareness of climate cycles informs agricultural and water management. Knowing that droughts recur encourages building reservoirs during wet years. Understanding multi-decadal oscillations helps plan crop choices and water allocation. Cyclical thinking can complement progressive action productively. Recognizing that setbacks are normal doesn't mean accepting them passively. Social movements face reaction and backlash predictably. Understanding this allows strategic planning rather than surprise and demoralization. Environmental movements recognize political support cycles and organize accordingly. Social justice movements understand waves of progress and backlash, maintaining momentum through difficult periods. Personal applications matter too. Understanding career cycles, learning, building, consolidating, transitioning informs decisions about when to invest in skills versus when to harvest experience. Recognizing emotional and energy cycles improves self-management. Appreciating larger historical cycles provides perspective during difficult times. This crisis fits patterns. It will pass. Renewal comes. Communities can build institutions functioning across cycles rather than depending on particular conditions. Counter-cyclical resources, grain storage during abundance, mutual aid networks during scarcity, diversified economies, resilient to sector-specific downturns, systems designed for recurring stresses rather than assuming permanent stability. This differs fundamentally from fatalistic cyclical thinking. Awareness becomes tool for action rather than excuse for inaction. Understanding mechanisms creates intervention opportunities. Recognizing patterns allows preparation and mitigation. Cyclical framework provides both hope this too shall pass and urgency we must act during windows of opportunity. The ancient question returns with modern applications. Knowing the wheel turns, can we smooth its rough edges? Can we transform destructive cycles into constructive ones? Can awareness inform wise action? The answer, emerging from modern engagement, yes, partially, imperfectly. We can't eliminate all cycles, but we can modify their impacts. We can't transcend pattern, but we can transform it. Awareness without action is mere philosophy. Action informed by awareness is wisdom. Nietzsche asked, "What if this moment recurs eternally? What if you've lived this exact life infinite times before and will infinite times again?" He wasn't asking about physics. He was asking, how would you live differently if everything you do, you do forever. The thought experiment is brutal in its clarity. Every choice repeated infinitely, every triumph, every failure, every mundane moment all recurring without end. The coffee you drink this morning, you've drunk infinite times before. This conversation, these exact words, endless repetition across eternity. Nietzsche called this eternal return, not as cosmological prediction but as philosophical test. If you knew your life would repeat exactly, identically, forever, would you embrace it? Or would the prospect fill you with horror? Most people, he suspected, would recoil. The same mistakes endlessly repeated, the same pain returning, the same mediocrity, cycling forever. This reaction reveals something about how we're living that we'd be horrified to repeat it, eternally suggests we're not living well. But what if you could affirm eternal return? What if you could say yes to every moment, including its infinite repetition? That, Nietzsche argued, would represent genuine freedom. Not freedom from cycles, but freedom within them. Amor fati, love of fate, embracing everything that happens as necessary and even desirable. Ancient cyclical cosmologies grappled with similar existential questions. Stoics accepted eternal recurrence as cosmic fact. The universe expands and contracts infinitely, each cycle identical to the last. Your life repeating, without variation across eternity. Their response: cultivate equanimity. Accept what can't be changed while acting wisely within constraints. Hindu philosophy describes endless cycles of birth and rebirth. Not identical repetition, but patterns recurring. The challenge becomes liberation, seeing through the cycle's nature to something beyond it. Or, if liberation seems distant, fulfilling dharma, right action appropriate to your position in the pattern. Buddhist teaching emphasizes the nature of cyclical existence. Everything conditioned arises and passes in patterns. Suffering comes from clinging to what's impermanent, from failing to see the cyclical nature of conditioned reality. Insight into this pattern offers freedom. These frameworks address the same existential challenge. If everything recurs, what's the point? If patterns repeat, do individual choices matter? If collapses follow triumphs, should we prevent collapse or prepare for renewal? The answers vary, but share something crucial. They don't counsel passive fatalism. They find meaning in the quality of action, regardless of outcomes. Stoic virtue remains regardless of external fortune. Buddhist practice continues despite impermanence. Hindu dharma remains right action whether the age is golden or dark. Nietzschean affirmation chooses engagement despite eternal return. The philosophical shift is profound. Meaning isn't found in final victory or permanent progress. Meaning emerges from how you exist within the pattern, from choosing how to engage with cycles you can't eliminate, from acting well despite knowing everything changes and perhaps repeats. The question eternal return poses isn't really about cosmology. It's about commitment. Would you choose this life again? And if not, what needs to change not in the world, but in how you engage with it? The cycles turn regardless. Your response defines you. Empires fall, markets crash, generations pass, everything changes. Cyclical wisdom isn't about predicting when. It's about living skillfully regardless, enjoying prosperity without clinging, enduring hardship without despair, acting meaningfully while accepting impermanence. Observing cycles teaches fundamental lessons. Everything that rises will fall. Every prosperity contains seeds of decline. Every collapse contains possibilities for renewal. Nothing lasts forever, not triumph, not defeat, not any condition. This awareness appears across traditions. Buddhist meditation focuses on anicca impermanence. Every sensation, every thought, every condition arises and passes. Clinging to what changes creates suffering. Seeing impermanence clearly creates freedom. Ecclesiastes teaches there's a time for every purpose. A time to plant and uproot, build and demolish, weep and laugh, mourn and dance. The seasons turn. Accepting this brings peace that fighting it never could. Stoics practiced contemplating change and loss deliberately. Imagine losing what you have. Recognize everything is borrowed temporarily. This practice doesn't create pessimism but appreciation. Knowing things won't last intensifies present experience. Hindu philosophy recognizes Maya, the illusion that forms are permanent. Everything flows and changes. Attachment to impermanent things creates suffering. Wisdom sees through the illusion to what endures beneath the cycles. This impermanence wisdom affects living profoundly. It prevents attachment to transient conditions. Success and failure both pass. Health and illness cycle. Relationships form and dissolve. Seeing this clearly creates equanimity. It generates appreciation for present moments, knowing they'll pass. This meal, this conversation, this sunset temporary and therefore precious. Impermanence intensifies rather than diminishes value. It inspires action since windows of opportunity are temporary. If you're going to act, act now. The moment passes. The cycle turns. What you can do now might become impossible later. Acceptance differs from resignation crucially. Acceptance recognizes reality while remaining engaged. You accept that empires fall while working to delay the fall, to make the transition less violent, to preserve what matters through the transformation. Resignation abandons effort and care. Cyclical thinking specifically shapes acceptance. If decline follows peak, enjoy prosperity without complacency. Build resilience during strength, knowing weakness comes. If renewal follows collapse, endure difficulty without despair. The wheel will turn. Darkness yields to light. If cycles continue, participate meaningfully without requiring permanent victory. Your contribution matters, even if patterns recur. Paradoxes emerge. Embrace impermanence while caring deeply. Accept limits while working for change. Know patterns repeat while treating each moment as unique. Recognize cycles while remaining open to genuine novelty. Practical applications follow naturally. During success, prepare for inevitable challenges. During failure, maintain hope for renewal. During stability, appreciate it while building resilience. During crisis, act wisely while accepting what can't be controlled. Cyclical wisdom isn't fatalism. It's skillful navigation of reality, living well within impermanence. Finding freedom not in permanence, but in grace amid constant change. The wheel turns. The wise turn with it. Ancient Egyptians built granaries for the lean years they knew would follow abundance. Modern systems optimize for current conditions and fail when cycles turn. Resilience isn't about preventing cycles, it's about surviving them. Building for cycles means accepting change as permanent. Cycle-aware design follows specific principles. Diversification reduces vulnerability to any single cyclical stress. Don't depend entirely on one crop, one industry, one income stream. When that cycle turns against you, alternatives sustain you. Redundancy provides backup when primary systems fail. Extra capacity seems wasteful during good times, but proves essential during bad. The unused hospital beds, the grain reserves, the idle production capacity, these are resilience, not waste. Flexibility allows adaptation to changing conditions across cycles. Rigid systems optimized for specific circumstances break when circumstances change. Flexible systems bend and adjust. Modularity prevents cascading failures by limiting interconnection. When one module fails, others continue functioning. Tight coupling creates efficiency but also fragility. One failure triggers many. Historical examples demonstrate cycle-aware wisdom. Joseph's strategy in Genesis: store grain during 7 abundant years to survive 7 lean years. Roman granary systems buffered agricultural cycles. Chinese dynastic storage policies moderated famine cycles. These civilizations understood that cycles were inevitable and preparation essential. Modern applications follow the same logic. Financial regulations requiring counter-cyclical capital buffers, banks must hold more reserves during booms, can draw them down during busts. Agricultural policies maintaining strategic reserves despite costs during abundance. Infrastructure built to survive infrequent but predictable extreme events, 100-year floods, century storms. Design principles emerge clearly. Don't optimize solely for current conditions. Build slack for bad times, even when it seems wasteful during good times. Don't assume current trends continue indefinitely. Anticipate reversal. Don't create tight coupling, making systems fragile. Maintain buffers, redundancy, modularity. Tension exists between efficiency and resilience. Optimization for current conditions creates maximum short-term performance, but fragility to change. Resilience requires maintaining excess capacity, redundancy, slack, all appearing wasteful by efficiency metrics. Short-term thinking pressures toward efficiency. Long-term thinking requires resilience, investment. Different timescales require different preparation. Daily cycles, energy, attention, mood need daily practices. Seasonal cycles need seasonal preparation. Multi-year economic cycles need financial buffers. Generational cycles need institutional design. Designing for multiple nested cycles creates genuine resilience. Community-scale applications matter practically. Local food systems reduce vulnerability to supply chain disruptions. Mutual aid networks activate during crises when official systems overwhelm. Skill diversity ensures communities can adapt when particular industries fail. Cultural practices maintain resilience knowledge across generations. Indigenous communities often embody cycle-aware resilience remarkably. Traditional ecological knowledge adapted to cyclical climate variations across centuries. Social institutions surviving many cycles. Cultural practices maintaining identity through upheavals. These represent tested strategies for enduring cycles. Individual resilience follows similar principles. Financial buffers for economic downturns. Diverse skills for changing employment cycles. Social networks for support during difficulties. Psychological flexibility for navigating change. Health practices, maintaining capacity across life cycles. Cycles can't be eliminated, but systems and practices can be built to survive them, transforming cycles from catastrophes into manageable challenges. Not through control but through resilience, not through prevention but through preparation, accepting change, building for it. The question isn't whether cycles exist. The question is, given cycles, given that everything rises and falls, builds and collapses, repeats and transforms, how do you choose to live? Your answer to that question is your philosophy, your meaning, your life. The existential challenge cuts deep. If patterns recur, if collapses follow triumphs, if nothing lasts, what creates meaning? Various philosophical traditions offer responses. Meaning comes from the quality of action regardless of outcomes. Stoic virtue remains whether your empire rises or falls. Meaning emerges from engagement with each unique moment despite broader patterns. Buddhist practice in this breath, this step, this moment. Meaning arises from connection and contribution to what continues beyond individual life. Planting trees you'll never sit under. Building institutions that outlast you. Meaning is created through choice and commitment within constraints. Existentialist freedom in choosing how to engage with cycles you can't eliminate. Cyclical thinking can enhance rather than diminish meaning. Appreciation for impermanence intensifies present experience. This conversation matters more knowing it won't last. Awareness of cycles creates urgency for timely action. Windows of opportunity close. Act now or lose the chance. Recognition of recurring challenges invites participation in perennial struggles. Every generation must defend democracy, pursue justice, seek truth. Your turn has come. Understanding renewal after collapse sustains hope and effort. This darkness will pass. Keep working toward light. Specific approaches emerge. Live with integrity regardless of cyclical position. Act ethically during decline as during prosperity. Your character isn't determined by circumstances, but by choices within them. Contribute to long-term projects, transcending individual cycles. Plant trees, build institutions, teach wisdom. Your direct impact might be small, but your contribution continues. Find meaning in process and participation, rather than final victory. The work matters, even if it's never finished. Embrace your role in larger patterns while maintaining individual authenticity. You're part of something larger while remaining uniquely yourself. Different traditions frame this differently. Hindu Dharma as right action appropriate to your position. Buddhist practice cultivating wisdom regardless of external cycles. Stoic virtue as internal excellence independent of external fortune. Existentialist authentic choice, creating meaning despite absurdity. Indigenous practices maintaining culture across cycles. Contemporary applications become clear. Engage politically despite awareness that progress cycles with regression. Build relationships knowing impermanence. Create art knowing it won't last. Work for justice knowing challenges will recur. The meaning comes from the engagement itself. Cyclical wisdom changes relationship to outcomes. Less attachment to winning permanently. More appreciation for temporary achievements. Greater resilience in face of setbacks. Deeper understanding that participating matters even if you don't control results. The paradox resolves itself. Cyclical thinking can create nihilism. Nothing matters if it all repeats. Or profound meaning, everything matters precisely because it's impermanent and your response defines you. The choice isn't determined by the cycles themselves, but by your philosophical stance toward existence. how you choose to engage with patterns you can't eliminate. The cycles turn regardless. Your response creates your meaning, your philosophy, your life. By multiple measures, generational, economic, political, environmental, we're in what cyclical frameworks call a crisis period. What this means depends on how we respond. Cycles suggest patterns, they don't dictate outcomes. This is the moment when choices matter most. Different frameworks position our current moment differently, but many converge on similar conclusions. In generational theory, we're potentially in a fourth turning a crisis period. The last fourth turning crisis ended around 1946, 78 years ago. If the pattern holds, we're entering the period when major transformations occur. In secular cycle theory, multiple indicators suggest crisis phase. Wealth inequality has reached levels historically associated with social breakdown. Elite overproduction, too many educated, credentialed people competing for limited positions of influence, creates political instability. Political cooperation deteriorates as factions compete rather than collaborate. In debt cycle terms, we're at a long-wave peak. Global debt relative to GDP stands at unprecedented levels. Government debt, corporate debt, household debt, all elevated simultaneously. Historical patterns suggest such debt accumulations eventually require resolution through some form of deleveraging. In Kondratiev wave theory, we might be transitioning between technology waves. Information technology's transformative phase may be maturing, while new technologies, renewable energy, biotechnology, artificial intelligence, begin their disruptive rise. Transitions between waves historically involve economic and social stress. In climate terms, we're in an interglacial period that's lasted about as long as previous ones, though human-caused disruption complicates natural patterns. Climate stress increases through both warming and increased variability. These frameworks differ in specifics, but suggest similar conclusions. We're in a period of heightened stress and potential transformation. Concrete indicators reinforce this assessment. Wealth inequality in many countries has reached levels not seen since before the Great Depression. Political polarization strains institutions designed to function through compromise. Democratic backsliding occurs in nations previously stable. Global debt ratios exceed historical peaks. Technological disruption transforms employment faster than social institutions can adapt. Climate stress creates recurring disasters. The pandemic revealed system vulnerabilities, supply chains, healthcare capacity, institutional trust. These stresses might represent convergence of multiple cycles. Economic, political, generational, technological, and environmental challenges aligning, creating compound crisis potential, not any single catastrophe, but multiple stresses reinforcing each other. Different analysts interpret this moment differently. Some see evidence of impending major crisis and transformation, that the convergence of cycles demands fundamental restructuring. Others see continuity with manageable challenges, that current problems, while significant, aren't unprecedented and can be addressed within existing frameworks. Some emphasize unprecedented aspects, technological change and climate change operating at scales and speeds without historical parallel, potentially breaking cyclical patterns. Others emphasize recurring dynamics, that what feels unprecedented now has precedents we've forgotten, that patterns are repeating as they always have. Why does our moment feel so uncertain? Living through potential cyclical transitions always feels more ambiguous than historical analysis suggests. We lack the hindsight that makes past patterns clear. We're too close to current events to know which will prove historically significant. This uncertainty is itself characteristic of transition periods. During crises, multiple futures seem possible. Outcomes depend partly on choices made during the transition. Anxiety about the future intensifies. Competing narratives emerge about what's happening and what should be done. Regardless of which specific framework is most accurate, the convergence of multiple indicators suggests we're in a period of heightened importance, a time when choices and actions might have outsized consequences for subsequent trajectory. Neither complacency nor panic serves us. Alert engagement does awareness of risks, combined with confidence in human capacity to respond wisely. History's lesson isn't that collapse is inevitable. It's that stress is inevitable, and response determines outcome. Some societies navigated transitions successfully, some didn't. The difference wasn't luck, it was choice, cohesion, adaptation, and wisdom. We face similar choices now. The first lesson: periods of stress and transformation are normal features of history, not aberrations. This recognition prevents both panic treating current challenges as unprecedented catastrophe and complacency, dismissing warnings as alarmist. Stress periods recur. How societies respond varies. Historical examples show multiple possible outcomes to similar stresses. Some societies collapsed catastrophically. Bronze Age civilizations disintegrated. Classic Maya cities were abandoned. Their collapses were real, severe, traumatic. But other societies transformed and adapted. China cycled through dynasties, collapsing and reunifying repeatedly, maintaining cultural continuity. Western Europe, after Rome's fall, experienced centuries of reduced complexity but eventually rebuilt. Some societies maintained surprising resilience. Byzantine Empire survived for 1,000 years after Rome's Western collapse, adapting repeatedly to changing conditions. Japan navigated multiple crises over centuries while maintaining identity. Outcomes depended on specific responses to shared stresses. What distinguished successful navigation? Maintaining social cohesion rather than fragmenting into destructive conflict. Societies that held together could adapt. Those that fractured into warring factions couldn't coordinate necessary responses. Adapting institutions to changing conditions rather than rigid adherence to failing systems. Successful societies reformed when circumstances required it. Failed societies clung to institutions that no longer worked, balancing immediate crisis response with long-term preparation, addressing current emergencies while building capacity for future challenges, investing in resilience during good times, building strategic reserves, maintaining redundant systems, preserving diverse capabilities. These investments seem wasteful during prosperity but prove essential during stress. Managing inequality to prevent social breakdown. Extreme inequality destroys the cooperation necessary for collective action. Societies that moderated inequality maintained cohesion. Those that allowed inequality to extremes fractured, maintaining knowledge and capacity through transitions. Societies that preserved skills, institutions, and memory could rebuild. Those that lost knowledge struggled longer. Historical collapses teach what to avoid, allowing complexity to become vulnerability through excessive optimization. Lean, efficient systems are fragile to change, letting inequality reach levels destroying cooperation. Fragmenting into competing factions unable to coordinate. Abandoning maintenance of essential systems. Losing institutional memory of how to respond to recurring challenges. Prioritizing short-term extraction over long-term sustainability. Patterns in successful crisis navigation emerge clearly. Leaders who unite rather than divide. Institutions that maintain legitimacy by serving broad interests. Populations that cooperate despite differences. Innovations addressing root challenges rather than symptoms. Investment in shared infrastructure and capacity. These lessons apply to current challenges directly. Address inequality to maintain social cohesion. Reform institutions to restore effectiveness and legitimacy. Build resilience in critical systems, food, energy, finance, health. Maintain knowledge and capacity for long-term challenges. Balance immediate needs with preparation for future stress. Find ways to cooperate across differences. The role of collective choice matters profoundly. Cycles create recurring patterns but not deterministic outcomes. How societies respond to cyclical stress varies widely. Our choices during crisis periods shape subsequent trajectories. Awareness of patterns can inform wiser choices. Maintaining perspective helps. Current challenges, while significant, aren't unprecedented in scale or kind. Humans have navigated major transitions before. Outcomes vary, but navigation is possible. Despair and complacency are both inappropriate. Engaged, wise effort is called for. History's lesson combines realism and hope. Stress is inevitable. Response determines outcome. The pattern suggests challenges. Our choices shape what comes next. The wheel turns. Birth, growth, peak, decline, death, rebirth. The pattern ancient eyes observed in nature, in history, in human affairs. We're still in the pattern, still on the wheel. The question remains what it's always been. Not whether the wheel turns, but how you choose to turn with it. We began by asking why ancient cultures independently developed cyclical theories about time and history. The journey has revealed answers layered deeper than simple explanation. These theories emerged from observation of real patterns. In nature, seasons cycling, the moon waxing and waning, ice ages advancing and retreating. In climate, droughts returning with rough periodicity, harvests varying in multi-generational patterns. In human society, civilizations rising and falling, political systems cycling through forms, economies booming and busting, generations replacing each other with predictable dynamics. They emerged from preservation of catastrophic memories. Flood myths remembering actual floods, stories of fire from heaven preserving impact events, tales of lost golden ages reflecting memories of different conditions or earlier civilizations. They emerged from psychological tendencies toward pattern recognition. Human brains evolved to find patterns. Sometimes we see patterns that genuinely exist. Sometimes we impose patterns on randomness, often both simultaneously. They emerged from philosophical reflection on impermanence. Everything that exists changes. Nothing lasts forever. Recognizing this truth, ancient wisdom traditions developed frameworks for living skillfully within constant transformation. What we've learned: cycles exist at multiple scales. Astronomical cycles driven by orbital mechanics, climate cycles from solar variations and ocean oscillations, ecological cycles from population dynamics, economic cycles from credit expansion and human psychology, political cycles from institutional aging and elite competition, generational cycles from biological replacement and memory loss, technological cycles from innovation, clustering, and diffusion. These cycles interact in complex ways, sometimes aligning to create major transformations, sometimes operating independently. The interactions themselves create higher-order patterns. But cycles aren't purely deterministic. Contingency shapes outcomes. Innovation creates genuinely new conditions. Choice matters. The future remains open even as patterns recur. Ancient cyclical wisdom offers not prediction but perspective, not fatalism but framework for engaging with change, not certainty but recognition of recurring patterns, not control but acceptance combined with wise action. The synthesis of cyclical and progressive views resolves their apparent contradiction. History involves both pattern and innovation, both repetition and novelty, both familiar cycles and unprecedented developments. Embracing this complexity is wiser than choosing pure cyclical or pure progressive frameworks. What matters going forward isn't whether we're in a cycle, but how we respond to whatever challenges we face. Not predicting exact timing, but preparing for predictable stresses. Not trying to stop all cycles, but building resilience to navigate them. Not abandoning effort because patterns recur, but engaging meaningfully because participation matters. There's peace in cyclical understanding. Accepting impermanence reduces anxiety. Recognizing patterns provides orientation. Understanding that others have navigated transitions creates hope. Participating in something larger than individual life creates meaning. The wheel endlessly turns, bringing seasons of growth and decay, challenge and renewal, difficulty and ease. But the wheel's turning isn't the story. The story is how we ride it, what we create during our turn, how we contribute to what continues beyond us. The ancient peoples who developed cyclical theories were observing something real. Their wisdom wasn't that cycles control everything, but that understanding patterns helps us live skillfully. We inherit both their observations and their challenge. To live meaningfully within cycles we can't eliminate. To build what lasts despite knowing nothing lasts forever. To participate fully while accepting impermanence. To find our place in patterns much larger than ourselves. The wheel turns, has always turned, will continue turning. How will you turn with it? You can't choose whether you live during stability or crisis, prosperity or collapse, a cycle's rise or fall. But you choose how you meet whatever comes with wisdom or folly, courage or fear, connection or isolation, meaning or despair. That choice is always yours. Your relationship to cycles begins with recognition of what you can't control. You didn't create the cycles you're born into. Economic conditions, political circumstances, generational dynamics, climate patterns, these existed before you and continue beyond you. You can't single-handedly prevent or accelerate major transformations. You can't will the wheel to stop turning. But you do choose how you respond to the conditions you encounter. This has always been the human situation. People throughout history have lived through cycles, some through prosperous stability, some through catastrophic transformations. Individual meaning and dignity came not from controlling cycles, but from how they engaged with their circumstances. Stoics during Rome's decline, Buddhists during war and peace. Ordinary people maintaining integrity through extraordinary times. Cyclical awareness offers specific gifts. Perspective during difficult times. This difficulty is part of larger pattern. not personal failure or unique catastrophe. Appreciation during good times, knowing impermanence, savoring what won't last. Preparation for change, anticipating that conditions will shift, building resilience before need arises. Reduced anxiety about uncertainty, understanding that uncertainty itself is normal, not aberration. Meaningful participation, contributing to what extends beyond individual life. Personal applications emerge naturally. During economic prosperity, build financial resilience for eventual downturn. Save when others spend. Reduce debt when credit flows easily. Maintain diverse income streams. During career success, develop diverse skills for changing conditions. Don't over-specialize in circumstances that won't last. During political stability, strengthen civic institutions for eventual stress. Participate, contribute, build social capital. During good health, establish practices sustainable through challenges. Exercise, connection, purpose. Investments paying returns across conditions. During stable relationships, appreciate them while they last. Nothing is guaranteed permanence. Cyclical wisdom shapes personal philosophy profoundly. Find meaning in quality of engagement rather than permanent victory. Your integrity, your effort, your contribution, these matter regardless of outcomes. Choose integrity regardless of external conditions. Be the same person during success and failure, prosperity and hardship. Contribute to projects larger than individual life. Plant trees, build institutions, teach wisdom, create beauty. Knowing your direct impact is temporary, but participation matters. Accept what you can't control while acting wisely within your sphere. This distinction, recognizing limits while remaining engaged, is wisdom itself. Maintain hope during difficulty and humility during success. Both conditions are temporary. Neither defines you. This differs from fatalism fundamentally. You're not passive before cycles, but active within them. Awareness creates opportunity for wise response. Accepting limits doesn't mean abandoning effort. Understanding patterns helps you choose how to engage. The freedom in cyclical understanding is real. Liberation from needing to control what you can't. Focus on what you actually influence. Permission to find meaning in participation rather than outcomes. Connection to larger patterns of human experience across time. Your individual choices matter. They shape your own experience and character. They influence people and systems around you in ways that compound. They contribute to collective responses affecting outcomes. They participate in creating conditions inherited by future generations. How to live well within cycles. Cultivate wisdom and skill serving across conditions. Build relationships enduring through change. Create and contribute regardless of guarantee of permanence. Maintain hope without illusion. Engage with reality as it is while working toward what could be. Find meaning in the engagement itself.